The summer of 1841 bore down on Harroway plantation like the weight of God's own judgment. The air in Milledgeville, Georgia, hung thick and suffocating, carrying the scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with something darker, sweat, fear, and the iron tang of blood that seemed to seep from the very earth itself. Mercy stood motionless in the cotton field, her slender frame casting a long shadow across the endless white rows. At 17, she should have possessed the vitality of youth, but her eyes told a different story. They were ancient eyes, hollowed out by grief and resignation, windows into a soul that had been systematically dismantled piece by piece since the day she drew her first breath on this cursed land. The sun climbed higher, transforming the Georgia clay into a furnace beneath bare feet that had long ago stopped feeling pain. Around her, 37 other souls moved through the rows with mechanical precision. Their songs, those mournful spirituals that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than the throat, providing the only soundtrack to their misery. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Mercy never sang. She hadn't spoken a word in 3 years, not since the morning she watched her father, Benjamin, dragged away in chains to a buyer from Alabama. Before that, she had been quiet for 2 years, ever since her mother, Sarah, collapsed under Overseer Dutch's whip and never rose again. The other slaves whispered that Mercy's silence was a kind of death, that she had buried her voice alongside her parents. But they were wrong. Mercy's silence was not death, it was accumulation. Every lash she witnessed, every indignity suffered, every cry that went unanswered added another brick to a structure being built deep within her, a monument to rage so pure and focused it could only be contained by perfect stillness. Master Jonathan Harroway emerged from the plantation house just before noon, his considerable bulk testing the seams of his waistcoat. At 53, he carried himself with the casual arrogance of a man who had never once been denied anything he desired. His face, florid from whiskey and heat, surveyed his property, both land and human, with the same dispassionate calculation one might use to assess livestock. Beside him, his wife Eleanor maintained her position like a pale spectre, her narrow face pinched into its perpetual expression of bitter disappointment. At 48, she ruled the domestic sphere of Harroway with an iron fist encased in lace, finding in cruelty the only satisfaction her loveless marriage could provide. Their sons completed this portrait of Southern aristocratic decay. Thomas, 22, possessed his father's appetites without the discipline of age to temper them. His younger brother William, 19, watched the world through calculating eyes, finding pleasure in the systematic application of suffering the way other men might enjoy chess. Dutch, the overseer, strode between the rows with his whip coiled at his belt like a sleeping serpent. He was a small man, made large by the authority vested in him, his weathered face bearing the permanent scowl of someone who had discovered that causing pain was the closest he would ever come to feeling powerful. "That one," Thomas Harroway said, his voice carrying across the field as he pointed directly at Mercy. "Bring her to the stables after supper." The words hung in the thick air like the tolling of a death bell. Around Mercy, the other slaves bent deeper into their work, as if invisibility might somehow protect them from being the next name called. Old Isaiah, who at 65 had survived 4 different masters, began to hum a different tune, one the elders recognized as a warning, a prayer, a lament. Mercy's hands never stopped moving through the cotton bowls, but something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of recognition that this moment had been inevitable, that it had been approaching since she was old enough to understand what it meant to be a woman in chains. The afternoon stretched into evening, the sun finally releasing its grip on the land as shadows grew long across Harroway's 500 acres. The slaves filed back toward their quarters, a collection of wooden shacks that leaned against each other like exhausted refugees. Inside these walls, families that had been fractured and reformed tried to create some semblance of life between the margins of their labor. Mercy washed her face and hands in the wooden bucket outside her cabin, the water already warm from sitting in the heat all day. She shared this space with Aunt Ruth, a woman of indeterminate age who had delivered Mercy into this world 17 years ago and had tried in her limited way to shield the girl from the worst of what plantation life meant for young women. "Child," Ruth's voice was barely a whisper, her gnarled hands gripping Mercy's shoulders with surprising strength. "You run, right now. You head for the river and you don't look back." Mercy met the old woman's gaze and slowly shook her head. Where would she run? The dogs would find her before dawn, the patrollers would return her, and her punishment would be distributed among everyone in the quarters as an example. And even if by some miracle she made it north, what waited for her there? Another kind of cage, perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. No, running was not the answer. Not anymore. As twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple, Mercy walked toward the stables with steady steps, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. Behind her, Ruth wept silently, and old Isaiah's humming took on a different quality. No longer a lament, but something else, something that sounded almost like anticipation. The stable smelled of hay, horse sweat, and saddle leather. Thomas Harroway waited in the shadows, his shirt already unbuttoned, a bottle of his father's bourbon dangling from one hand. He smiled when he saw her, the kind of smile that contained no warmth, only appetite. "You know why you're here," he said. "Not a question, but a statement of fact. And you know better than to make this difficult." Mercy stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. For the first time in 3 years, she opened her mouth to speak, and her voice emerged like something rusty and forgotten, unused muscles remembering their purpose. "I know," she said, and Thomas Harroway was too drunk and too certain of his dominion to hear what lay beneath those two simple words, not submission, but promise. What happened in that stable over the next hour would be discovered 3 weeks later by William Harroway, who would find his brother's journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his room. The entries from that night, written in Thomas's sprawling, careless hand, would be considered too disturbing to share even among the family, eventually burned by Eleanor Harroway herself, her face white as bone as the pages curled and blackened in the parlor fireplace. But journals burn easier than memories, and what Thomas did to Mercy that July night became the match that would ignite an inferno. Mercy returned to the quarters well past midnight, her dress torn, her lips split, dried blood on her thighs. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply lay down on her pallet and stared at the ceiling where moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, creating patterns that looked almost like the bars of a cage. Ruth tried to tend to her wounds, but Mercy pushed her hands away. There was no point. Some injuries went too deep for poultices and prayers. Some violations demanded a different kind of healing. The next morning, Eleanor Harroway summoned Mercy to the main house. The mistress had heard, of course. Servants' gossip traveled faster than wildfire through the plantation's intricate network of whispers and knowing glances. But Eleanor's concern was not for the violation itself. In her world, such things were unfortunate but inevitable aspects of the natural order. No, Eleanor's fury had a different source entirely. She had seen the way Thomas looked at Mercy the next morning at breakfast, not with the casual dismissal that should follow such encounters, but with something else, a lingering attention that suggested the matter was not concluded, that he might develop an attachment that could prove embarrassing. "You tempted him," Eleanor hissed, her face inches from Mercy's, her breath smelling of laudanum and rage. "You used your wiles to corrupt my son, just like your kind always does." Mercy said nothing, which only inflamed Eleanor further. The mistress's hand shot out, striking Mercy across the face with enough force to split her already damaged lip anew. Blood welled up, warm and copper on her tongue. "Speak when you're spoken to, girl." "What would you have me say, mistress?" Mercy's voice emerged flat, empty of inflection or emotion. The answer, whatever Eleanor might have demanded, never came. Instead, she turned to Dutch, who had been summoned to the house for precisely this purpose. 20 lashes, Eleanor said, her voice cold as January ice. And then brand her, the mark on her shoulder, where everyone can see what happens to slaves who forget their place. After that, lock her in the punishment shed. 3 days, no food, no water. Let her think about her sins. Dutch's eyes gleamed with an enthusiasm that made even Eleanor look away. "Yes, ma'am. I'll see to it right away." The whipping post stood in the center of the yard, positioned so that everyone in the quarters would have a clear view. It was a deliberate arrangement. Punishment was meant to be witnessed, its lessons absorbed by all. By the time Dutch led Mercy to the post, a crowd had gathered, their faces carefully blank, eyes downcast. To show sympathy was to risk joining the condemned. Mercy was stripped to the waist and bound to the post, her thin back already crisscrossed with old scars, a map of every infraction, real or imagined, that had preceded this moment. She did not beg. She did not plead. She simply pressed her forehead against the weathered wood and waited. The first strike of the whip painted a line of fire across her shoulders. The second followed quickly, then the third. Dutch was methodical, spacing his blows for maximum impact, making each one count. By the 10th lash, Mercy's back was a tapestry of blood and torn flesh. By the 20th, she had bitten through her bottom lip to keep from screaming, her blood staining the base of the post. But she did not break. Even as her knees buckled and consciousness wavered, she held on to something deep inside herself. A core of pure will that refused to shatter no matter what violence was inflicted upon her body. The branding came next. Dutch heated the iron in a portable brazier, the letter H for Harroway, glowing orange hot. The smell of burning flesh filled the yard as he pressed it against Mercy's right shoulder, the sizzle audible even over the sound of her sharply indrawn breath, the only sound she permitted herself to make. Finally, they dragged her to the punishment shed, a structure half buried in the earth to keep it cool in summer and cold in winter, designed specifically to maximize suffering. It was barely large enough for a person to lie down, with gaps in the walls that admitted insects, but not enough air to breathe comfortably. The door was locked, and Mercy was left in darkness, her wounds seeping, her body trembling from shock. 3 days, Eleanor had said. 3 days to think about her sins, but Eleanor Harroway had made a critical miscalculation. She had assumed that suffering would break Mercy's spirit, would return her to docility and submission. She could not have known that suffering, when pushed past a certain threshold, transforms into something else entirely. Not weakness, but a clarity so pure and terrible it becomes indistinguishable from madness or divinity. In that shed, in that darkness, with her blood soaking into the Georgia clay, Mercy did indeed think about her sins. But they were not the sins Eleanor imagined. Mercy's sin was patience. Her sin was silence. Her sin was allowing this world to continue turning while she still drew breath. On the 3rd day, just before dawn, old Isaiah passed by the shed on his way to the well. He heard nothing from within, no sounds of life or movement. For a moment, he wondered if the girl had finally succumbed, if her silence had become permanent. Then, so faint he almost missed it, he heard her voice drifting through the gaps in the walls, speaking words in a language he didn't recognize, something old, something that predated the Christianity the masters had tried to force upon them, reaching back to darker, older gods that had never promised mercy or salvation, only the cold comfort of vengeance. Isaiah hurried away, his heart hammering in his chest. He had heard stories from his grandmother, who had been brought from Africa on a slave ship when she was just a girl. She had told him about the old ways, about power that came not from submission, but from suffering, transformed into purpose. She had warned him that sometimes, when the pain became too great, a person could pierce the veil between worlds and touch something on the other side, something that might touch back. At dawn, on the fourth day, Dutch approached the shed with a bucket of water and a piece of stale cornbread, prepared to unlock the door and see what remained of Jonathan Harroway's property. He had witnessed hundreds of punishments over his 15 years as overseer and had developed an intuitive sense for when someone would break. Mercy, he had calculated, would be properly broken by now. He lifted the heavy bar and pulled open the door. The interior was dark, the early morning light not yet strong enough to penetrate the shadows. Dutch peered inside, expecting to see a broken girl, perhaps dead, certainly no longer a problem. The shed was empty. The chains that should have bound her ankles lay on the floor, still locked, the iron apparently having passed through solid flesh without leaving a mark. The dirt floor bore the imprint of her body, a dark stain where her blood had soaked into the earth. But Mercy herself was gone. Dutch stood frozen in the doorway, his rational mind struggling to comprehend what his eyes were telling him. There was no way out. The door had been barred from the outside. The walls were solid. The gaps were far too small for even a child to squeeze through. "Impossible," he whispered, and somewhere in the distance a crow cawed 3 times, a sound that made every slave within earshot stop what they were doing and look toward the main house with expressions of carefully hidden anticipation. Mercy was gone. But her absence felt less like an escape and more like a promise. The game, though no one at the main house knew it yet, had fundamentally changed. The girl who never spoke, who had been systematically destroyed piece by piece, had vanished into the morning mist like smoke, like a ghost, like an idea that could no longer be contained. And somewhere, in the red clay hills of Georgia, in the shadows of the pines, in the spaces between what was known and what was feared, Mercy began her work. The soil of Harroway plantation would soon learn that some debts could only be paid in blood and screams, that some wrongs demanded a reckoning that went beyond law or mercy or anything civilized people might recognize as justice. The masters had taught her about suffering. Now Mercy would teach them about consequence. The disappearance of Mercy sent ripples of unease through Harroway plantation like a stone dropped into still water. Dutch stood in the doorway of the empty punishment shed for a full minute, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes confirmed. The locked chains, the sealed door, the impossible absence. He ran his calloused hand along the wooden frame, searching for some rational explanation, a loose board, a hidden tunnel, anything that would restore order to a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. But the shed was exactly as it had been built 15 years ago, solid, secure, escape-proof. "Master Harroway needs to hear about this," Dutch muttered, though some instinct deep in his gut told him that reporting this would only make it more real, more dangerous. By the time the sun had fully risen over the cotton fields, the entire plantation knew. News traveled through the quarters in whispers and meaningful glances, spreading faster than Dutch could saddle his horse. The slaves who had witnessed Mercy's punishment now watched the overseer's obvious distress with carefully hidden expressions, their faces masks of ignorance that concealed something else, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. Jonathan Harroway received the news in his study, where he had been reviewing the plantation's accounts with his eldest son. The master's reaction was immediate and predictable: fury at the loss of property, embarrassment at the failure of his systems, and a nagging unease that he refused to acknowledge even to himself. "Impossible," he declared, slamming his ledger shut. "Girls don't vanish from locked sheds. She's hiding somewhere on the property, probably crawled into the woods to die." Dutch, Organize a search party. Take the dogs. I want her found before sunset." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding his father's gaze. He had said nothing about what happened in the stables 3 nights ago, and his father had not asked. Some things were simply understood between men of their class, agreements made in silence about what was acceptable and what need never be spoken aloud. But now, with Mercy gone, Thomas felt something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. He remembered her eyes in the stable, how they had looked through him rather than at him, as if she were seeing something else entirely, something that existed beyond the boundaries of that moment. "Maybe we should just let her go," Thomas said quietly. "Write her off as a loss. She's probably dead in the woods already." Jonathan turned to his son with an expression of disbelief. "Let her go, and have every slave in Georgia thinking they can just walk away whenever they please. We find her, we make an example of her, or we lose control of this entire operation. You understand?" Eleanor Harroway entered the study without knocking, her face pale beneath her mourning powder. "The servants are talking," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "They're saying she walked through walls, that she called on something in that shed, something old." "Superstitious nonsense," Jonathan snapped, but his hand trembled slightly as he poured himself a bourbon despite the early hour. "It's barely 8 in the morning, Eleanor. Control yourself." "Control myself?" Eleanor's voice rose to a pitch that made both men wince. "I saw her eyes after the branding, Jonathan. There was something there, something that wasn't natural. And now she's gone, vanished from a locked shed, and you want me to remain calm." William Harroway appeared in the doorway, his young face wearing the same calculating expression he always carried. "Mother's right," he said flatly. "The slaves are frightened, not of punishment. They're used to that. They're frightened of her, of what she might do." "She's a 17-year-old girl," Jonathan roared, his composure finally cracking. "What exactly do you think she's going to do?" No one answered, because none of them wanted to voice what they were all thinking. That Mercy's silence over the past 3 years hadn't been weakness or acceptance, but accumulation. That they had mistaken stillness for submission. That they had poured cruelty into a vessel they assumed to be broken, never considering that it might simply be filling up, preparing to overflow. Dutch returned 3 hours later, his dogs whining and refusing to track, his men empty-handed and visibly unsettled. "We followed every trail within 5 miles, he reported, his hat clutched in weathered hands. "The dogs picked up her scent from the shed, but it just ends, about 50 yards into the woods, like she just stopped existing." "Dogs can't track through water," Jonathan said, grasping for rational explanations. "She must have waded through the creek." "We checked the creek, sir. Both directions for 2 miles, nothing." Dutch paused, then added reluctantly, "The dogs acted strange, like they were afraid. These are hunting dogs, Mr. Harroway. They've tracked runaway slaves through swamps and over mountains. But today, they wouldn't go past a certain point in the woods, just sat down and howled." Jonathan dismissed Dutch and his excuses, then spent the rest of the morning composing letters to neighboring plantations, warning them to watch for a runaway slave girl, 17 years old, slim build, branded with an H on her right shoulder, considered dangerous due to mental instability. He offered a substantial reward for her return, though the amount seemed to grow with each draft, as if he were trying to price his own peace of mind. But Mercy was not running. She had been running her entire life, from the overseer's whip, from the master's sons, from a future that promised only more of the same suffering in an endless cycle. Now, for the first time since her mother died, Mercy stood perfectly still. She stood in the deep woods 3 miles from Harroway plantation, in a clearing that had no name, in a place that slaves whispered about but never visited. The old ones called it the listening place, a spot where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits grew thin as spider silk. Mercy's wounds had not healed, the lash mark still wept, the brand still burned, but pain had become background noise, no more relevant than the sound of wind through pine branches. She had moved beyond pain into a state of perfect clarity, where her purpose shone like a beacon in the darkness. She had not eaten in 4 days, had barely drunk water. Her body was failing, consuming itself for fuel, but her mind had never been sharper. In the punishment shed, during those 3 days of darkness and suffering, something had answered when she called out in her grandmother's language, words she had heard as a child but never fully understood until the moment they left her lips. The response had not been gentle or kind. It had not promised salvation or relief. It had simply offered her a choice: die in that shed, or live long enough to make them understand what they had created. Mercy had chosen understanding. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath. Birds had stopped singing. Even the insects had gone quiet. In the center of the clearing stood a twisted oak tree, its trunk split by lightning years ago, leaving a hollow space like an open mouth. At its base, Mercy had built a small altar from stones and bones, decorating it with items she had taken from the quarters before her disappearance. A lock of her mother's hair, saved for 3 years in a cloth bundle, a button from her father's shirt, and a small carved figure that had belonged to her grandmother, smuggled from Africa decades ago. She knelt before this altar and began to speak in a voice that was hers, but also not hers, words flowing from somewhere deep and old, a language that predated English and Christianity and all the false names the masters had tried to impose on the world. She spoke for hours, outlining her terms, her prices, her demands. What she wanted was simple: justice. What she was willing to pay was everything. The shadows in the clearing grew longer, though the sun had not moved. The temperature dropped despite the July heat, and something in the hollow of that lightning-struck oak began to listen with an attention that felt almost physical, like invisible eyes fixed on Mercy's kneeling form. When she finally fell silent, the forest remained quiet for 3 heartbeats. Then a sound emerged from the oak's hollow. Not quite wind, not quite breath, but something in between. It carried with it the smell of old earth and older blood, of things that had been buried and refused to stay down. Mercy smiled for the first time in 3 years. It was not a happy expression. 3 days, she whispered to the darkness in the tree. Give me 3 days, and the debt will be paid in full. The darkness seemed to nod, or perhaps it was just the branches moving in a wind that touched nothing else in the clearing. Either way, a bargain had been struck. Back at Harroway plantation, the first day of Mercy's absence ended, with nervous energy crackling through both the main house and the quarters. Slaves who had witnessed her punishment found excuses to walk past the empty shed, staring at the locked chains, the door that showed no signs of forced entry, the impossible absence. Old Isaiah gathered a small group in his cabin after sunset. People he trusted, people who remembered the old ways. They sat in a circle on the dirt floor, while Isaiah burned sage and recited prayers in a mixture of English and languages that had survived the Middle Passage. She's not running, he told them, his ancient eyes reflecting the candlelight. She's preparing. Something answered her in that shed. I heard it, felt it. The air itself changed. What kind of something? Asked Ruth, her voice trembling. She had raised Mercy, loved her like a daughter, and now feared for her soul more than her body. Isaiah was quiet for a long moment. The kind that doesn't forget, the kind that's been waiting a long time for someone angry enough and hurt enough to open the door. He paused. My grandmother told me stories back when I was young. She said that sometimes, When suffering becomes too great, a person can pierce the veil, can touch powers that the masters don't believe in because they've forgotten how to see anything except their own reflection. What happens then? Ruth whispered. Then? Isaiah looked at each of them in turn. Then the debt gets paid, but not just by the ones who owed it. Everyone pays, the guilty, the innocent, the in-between. That's the problem with vengeance. It spreads like fire, and fire doesn't care what it burns. In the main house, Eleanor Harroway could not sleep. She lay beside her husband, listening to his drunken snoring, staring at the ceiling while shadows moved in ways that shadows should not move. Every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps. Every whisper of wind through the windows sounded like breathing. She rose finally, wrapping herself in a dressing gown, and walked through the darkened halls with a candle clutched in trembling hands. She had consumed twice her usual dose of laudanum, but instead of bringing peace, it only made the shadows more animate, more purposeful. She found herself outside Thomas's room and opened the door without knocking. Her son lay sprawled across his bed, still dressed, an empty bottle on the floor beside him. In sleep, his face looked younger, almost innocent, and Eleanor felt a surge of maternal protectiveness that bordered on ferocity. "It was just a slave," she whispered to the darkness, as if trying to convince some invisible judge. "They're not like us. They don't feel things the same way. What he did was wrong, perhaps, but not unforgivable. Not worth this." But even as she spoke, she knew she was lying. She had seen Mercy's eyes after the branding, had recognized something human in that gaze. Pain, yes, but also awareness, consciousness, soul. All the things Eleanor had spent her entire adult life denying in order to live with herself. She retreated to her own room and consumed more laudanum, chasing oblivion. When she finally slept, she dreamed of a girl standing in flames, chains glowing red-hot around her ankles, eyes reflecting a light that came from no earthly fire. The second day brought new strangeness. The dogs that had refused to track the day before now refused to eat, cowering in their kennel and whining whenever anyone approached. 3 of Jonathan's best hunting hounds simply lay down and died overnight, with no visible injuries or signs of poison. In the fields, the slaves worked in unusual silence. The songs that normally provided rhythm to their labor had ceased. Even the overseers noticed it, commenting nervously that the quiet felt unnatural, oppressive, like the stillness before a storm. At noon, a field hand named Samuel collapsed in the cotton rows, convulsing and speaking in tongues. By the time Dutch reached him, Samuel's eyes had rolled back in his head, and he was speaking in a voice that was definitely not his own. Higher, younger, feminine. 3 days, the voice said through Samuel's lips. 2 remain. The debt will be paid. Then Samuel went limp, and when he woke minutes later, he remembered nothing except a dream of fire and chains, and a girl who smiled while the world burned. Dutch reported the incident to Jonathan, who dismissed it as heat stroke and overwork. But that afternoon, he reduced the slaves' hours and increased their water rations, a concession that shocked everyone who knew him. Fear, it seemed, could accomplish what compassion never could. Eleanor spent the second day in her room, curtains drawn, surrounded by candles despite the heat. She had sent for Reverend Patterson from Milledgeville, needing spiritual reassurance that would never come. The Reverend arrived at sunset, a thin man with kind eyes and a faith that had never been truly tested. "I need you to bless the house," Eleanor told him, gripping his hands with desperate strength. "Something's wrong here. Something evil. I can feel it." Reverend Patterson performed the blessing, walking through each room with his Bible and holy water, speaking prayers that echoed through the empty halls. But when he reached the study where Jonathan kept his records, detailed accounts of every slave bought, sold, whipped, or worked to death over 20 years, his voice faltered. "Mrs. Harroway," he said quietly, "sometimes evil doesn't come from outside. Sometimes we invite it in through our own actions. Sometimes blessing a house isn't enough if the foundation itself is built on suffering. Eleanor stared at him with wide, horrified eyes. "Are you saying we deserve what's happening?" "I'm saying," the Reverend replied carefully, "that every seed we plant grows according to its nature. If we plant cruelty, we shouldn't be surprised when cruelty springs up around us." He left before supper, and Eleanor never invited him back. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, too corrosive to faith and social order. That night, Thomas woke to find his room filled with smoke, though no fire burned. The smoke carried the scent of burning flesh, just like the smell when they had branded Mercy. He stumbled from his bed, gasping, and threw open the windows, but the smoke only grew thicker. In the mirror above his wash basin, he saw something that made his blood freeze, a figure standing behind him, slim and feminine, wrapped in shadows. When he spun around, the room was empty, but on his pillow, where his head had lain, was a single word burned into the fabric as if by a branding iron: Mercy. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. The third day dawned with an atmosphere of dread so thick it seemed to coat everything like morning dew. Even Jonathan, who had spent 40 years cultivating an impenetrable certainty in his own rightness, found himself jumping at shadows and double-checking locks. The slaves worked with their eyes downcast. But there was something different in their posture now. Not quite defiance, but an absence of submission. They moved through their tasks with mechanical efficiency while their minds were clearly elsewhere, focused on some approaching event that only they could sense. At midday, the well water turned red. Dutch drew up the bucket and stared in horror at the crimson liquid that looked exactly like blood. He tasted it cautiously. It was still water, clear and clean, but when he poured it into a cup, it ran red as arterial flow. "It's clay," Jonathan insisted when Dutch reported it. "Red clay from the surrounding soil. It happens sometimes after heavy rains." "It hasn't rained in 2 weeks, sir," Dutch pointed out quietly. Jonathan had no response to that. That afternoon in the cotton fields, 3 separate workers claimed to see a girl standing at the tree line, watching them. She wore a torn dress, they said, and chains on her ankles, and when the sun hit her shoulder just right, you could see the brand mark glowing like it had just been made. Each time someone pointed her out, she was gone by the time others looked. But the descriptions were always the same. Mercy, exactly as she had been the day she vanished, standing perfectly still, watching the plantation with eyes that reflected no light. Eleanor saw her too. She was sitting in the parlor, trying to read her Bible with shaking hands, when movement outside the window caught her attention. Mercy stood in the middle of the front lawn in broad daylight, still as a statue, staring directly at the house. Eleanor screamed and dropped her Bible. By the time Jonathan and the boys rushed into the room, the lawn was empty. But in the soft earth where Mercy had been standing, they found footprints, small, bare feet still visible in the dirt. And circling those footprints, burned into the grass in a perfect ring, were words in a language none of them recognized, though old Isaiah, watching from the quarters, understood them perfectly. They were in his grandmother's tongue, the language of her people, and they translated roughly to, "The debt comes due at sunset." As the third day drew to a close, Jonathan Harroway gathered his family in the study. His face had aged a decade in 3 days, his hands trembling so badly he could barely pour his bourbon. "We're leaving," he announced. "Tonight. Pack whatever you need. We're going to stay with your sister in Savannah until this madness passes." "Running?" William asked, his voice sharp with contempt. "From a slave girl?" "From whatever this is," Jonathan shot back. "I don't know what's happening here, but I know when I'm outmatched. We leave in 2 hours, that's final." But even as he spoke, he knew it was too late. The debt had been accumulating for 20 years, for generations, for as long as men had convinced themselves that owning other humans was their divine right. And debts like that could not be outrun. Mercy stood in the clearing as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the Georgia sky in shades of blood and fire. The 3 days were nearly complete. Her body was failing. She could feel it in the weakness of her limbs, the irregular beating of her heart, but she would not need her body much longer. The darkness in the oak tree had kept its part of the bargain, lending her strength that was not human, allowing her to appear and disappear like smoke, to speak through other mouths, to make the very earth remember the blood that had soaked into it over decades of violence. Now it was time to complete her part of the agreement. She knelt once more before the altar of bones and stones, and with a sharp rock she carved 3 symbols into the meat of her left palm, old marks that her grandmother had shown her in dreams. Blood welled up, dripping onto the earth, and where it fell, the ground itself seemed to shudder and wake. "Tonight," she whispered to the darkness, to the earth, to the spirits of all those who had died in chains and unmarked graves. "Tonight, the debt is paid in full. Tonight they learned that mercy was never ours to beg for. It was theirs to give, and they refused." The sun touched the horizon, and shadows began to grow long across Harroway plantation. In the quarters, every slave stood facing toward the main house, silent and waiting. They did not know exactly what was coming, but they could feel it in their bones, in the marrow-deep memory of every injustice their people had endured. Old Isaiah stood at the front of the group, his lips moving in prayer, but he was not praying for protection or salvation. He was praying for witnesses, for remembrance, for whatever came next to be recorded in memory and song, so that it would never be forgotten. In the main house, the Harroway family made final preparations to flee. But as Jonathan opened the front door, he froze. The door would not open. It was not locked. The mechanism turned freely, but the door itself would not budge, as if the house itself had decided to keep them inside. They tried every door, every window. All of them were the same. Unlocked but immovable, held shut by some force that had nothing to do with wood or metal or anything that could be seen or touched. "What's happening?" Eleanor screamed, pounding on the windows. "Let us out! Let us out!" But the house had become a cage, and as the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, they heard it. Footsteps on the front porch. Slow, deliberate, bare feet on wooden boards. Then a voice, young and feminine, speaking for the first time in 3 years with perfect clarity. 3 days I gave you. 3 days to run, to confess, to make peace with whatever God you claim to serve. You did none of those things, so now we do this the hard way. The door that would not open for the Harroway family swung wide on its hinges, and Mercy walked into her master's house at last. No longer a slave, no longer silent, no longer bound by anything except her own terrible purpose. The reckoning had begun. Mercy stood in the doorway of Harroway's grand foyer, backlit by moonlight that seemed too bright, too cold. She looked exactly as she had 3 days ago. The same torn dress, the same wounds that should have killed her, the same chains around her ankles that should have held her captive. But everything about her presence had changed. She was no longer a thing that could be owned. Jonathan Harroway stood on the staircase, his hunting rifle trembling in his hands. Behind him, Eleanor clutched William's arm while Thomas pressed himself against the wall, his face the color of old bone. For 20 years, Jonathan had maintained absolute authority over 300 acres and 37 human souls. Now, facing this 17-year-old girl, he felt his certainty crumble like sandcastles before a tide. "You get out of my house," he said, his voice cracking despite his attempts at command. "You walk back through that door, or I swear to God I'll shoot you where you stand." Mercy tilted her head, studying him with eyes that reflected moonlight in shades that had nothing to do with human biology. When she spoke, her voice carried an echo, as if multiple throats were shaping the words. "Your house? She took one step forward, her chains scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like grinding bones. This house was built by men who died in your service. The bricks were laid by hands that bled in your fields. Every board, every nail, every stone was paid for in suffering. So tell me, Master Harroway, what exactly makes this house yours? Jonathan pulled the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash bright enough to leave spots in everyone's vision. But when the smoke cleared, Mercy stood exactly where she had been, untouched. The bullet had struck the doorframe 3 feet to her left, wood splintering, the round embedded deep in the oak. "Your aim was true," Mercy said softly. "I saw you sight down the barrel, saw you aim for my heart." She placed her hand over her chest. "But the house moved the bullet. The wood itself bent to protect me. Because this house remembers who built it, who maintained it, who cleaned every corner while you and yours lived in the comfort our labor provided." Jonathan lowered the rifle, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. "What are you?" "I'm exactly what you made me," Mercy replied. "Every lash, every cruelty, every indignity, you shaped me into this. I'm your creation, Master. You should be proud." Eleanor's laudanum-fogged mind finally processed what was happening, and she released a sound somewhere between a laugh and a scream. "She's a demon, a devil. Thomas, William, don't just stand there. Get your father's other rifles." But neither son moved. They stood frozen, their eyes fixed on Mercy as she climbed the stairs toward them, one slow step at a time, her chains creating a rhythm like a funeral drum. "A demon?" Mercy paused, considering. "Perhaps. But demons are honest about what they are. They don't dress their cruelty in scripture and propriety. They don't convince themselves that owning other souls is God's will." She continued climbing. "So if I'm a demon, what does that make all of you?" Thomas found his voice first, high and desperate. "I didn't mean what happened in the stable. I was drunk. You were sober enough to plan it," Mercy interrupted, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Sober enough to send Dutch to fetch me specifically. Sober enough to bolt the door from inside." She stopped on the step directly below him, forcing him to look down into her eyes. "Sober enough to ignore every word I didn't say, every tear I didn't cry, every way my body tried to tell you no." Thomas pressed harder against the wall, as if he could somehow push himself through it to safety. "I'm sorry," he whimpered. "God help me, I'm sorry." "God isn't here," Mercy said flatly. "I called for him in that stable, called for him in the punishment shed." He didn't answer. "But something else did. Something older, something that doesn't forgive, doesn't forget, and doesn't care about your apologies." She turned her attention to Eleanor, who had begun reciting prayers in a desperate, continuous stream. "And you, mistress, you knew what your sons were. You knew what your husband permitted. You knew, and you called it natural order, called it civilization, called it God's design." Mercy's expression held no anger, something far colder. "The brand on my shoulder is your doing. You ordered it, watched it happen, smiled while my flesh burned because you thought it would teach me my place." "I was protecting my family," Eleanor shrieked. "You were threatening to corrupt my son." "I was bleeding on the floor of a stable." Mercy's voice remained eerily calm. "But you're right about one thing. I was a threat. Because if someone like me could be human, could have dignity, could deserve mercy, then everything about your world falls apart. So you had to make me into something less, something you could hurt without guilt." Jonathan had been slowly backing up the stairs during this exchange, trying to position himself for another shot. But his foot caught on the carpet runner, and he tumbled backward, the rifle clattering from his hands. He sprawled on the landing, looking up at Mercy, who now stood over him like a judge pronouncing sentence. "Please," he whispered, all pretense of authority finally stripped away. "Whatever you want, money, your freedom papers, passage north, just name it." "What I want," Mercy said, "you gave away a long time ago. You took my mother, sold my father, stole my childhood, my innocence, my voice. So no, Master Harroway, there's nothing you can offer me, nothing you have that I want, except one thing." "What?" Jonathan's voice was barely audible. "Understanding." Mercy knelt beside him, bringing her face close to his. "I want you to understand exactly what you did, not just to me, but to every soul that suffered under your authority. I want you to feel it, carry it, know it the way we've known it. And the only way to teach that lesson is through experience." She stood, backing away from the family that was now huddled together on the landing, their former hierarchy forgotten in shared terror. "The orchard," she said, "that's where we're going. All of you. Now." "We're not going anywhere with you," William said, trying to sound brave and failing. "You can't make us." Mercy smiled, and it was the saddest expression any of them had ever seen. "I don't have to make you. The house will." The floorboards beneath their feet suddenly lurched, tilting at a sharp angle. The family slid down the stairs, grabbing at banisters that seemed to twist away from their hands. They tumbled into the foyer in a heap of tangled limbs and torn fabric. And when they looked up, every door in the house had opened except one, the front door, which now stood wide, revealing the orchard beyond, illuminated by moonlight that turned the apple trees into twisted silver skeletons. "Walk," Mercy commanded, "or be dragged. The house doesn't care which." They walked. The orchard occupied 5 acres on the western edge of the plantation, planted by Jonathan's father 30 years ago. The trees had prospered in Georgia's red clay, producing apples that won prizes at the county fair. But the slaves knew something the Harroways didn't. The orchard grew so well because it was planted over the old burial ground, where slaves who died without names or ceremonies had been laid to rest in unmarked graves. The trees fed on their bones, their suffering, their unquiet spirits. And on nights when the moon was full, you could hear sounds coming from the orchard that had nothing to do with wind or wildlife. Mercy led her former masters between the rows of trees, her bare feet making no sound on the fallen apples that carpeted the ground. Behind her, the Harroways stumbled and gasped, their fine clothes snagging on branches that seemed to reach for them deliberately. In the center of the orchard stood the oldest tree, a massive specimen that Jonathan's father had planted first, marking it as the patriarch of the grove. Its trunk was easily 8 feet around, its branches spreading like arms desperate to embrace. At its base, the earth had been disturbed recently. Someone had been digging. 4 holes gaped in the ground, each one roughly the size of a coffin, but vertical rather than horizontal. They were narrow shafts that dropped straight down into darkness, deep enough that the bottom couldn't be seen even in the bright moonlight. "What is this?" Jonathan demanded, though his voice carried no authority anymore, only fear. "Justice," Mercy replied simply. She turned to face them, and for the first time they could see the full extent of her injuries in the clear light. The lash marks that crisscrossed her back, the brand on her shoulder still weeping, the bruises that covered her arms and legs, the split lip that had never been tended. "You put me in the ground to die. Now you'll understand what that feels like." Eleanor began to scream, high and piercing, but the sound died almost immediately, cut off, as if someone had placed a hand over her mouth. She clawed at her throat, trying to force sound past vocal cords that no longer responded to her commands. "I took your voice," Mercy said conversationally, "like mine was taken. For 3 years, I said nothing because there was no point. No one would listen, no one would care. Now, you'll know that silence." "You can't do this," William said, backing away. "This is murder. You'll hang for this." "Who will report it?" Mercy gestured to the empty fields around them. "Your slaves, the people you've brutalized for generations? You think they'll mourn you, or will they sing while the dirt covers your screams?" Thomas tried to run. He made it 3 steps before roots erupted from the ground, wrapping around his ankles, dragging him down. He struggled against them, tearing his hands bloody on the bark-like surface, but they held firm, pulling him inexorably toward one of the vertical shafts. "No!" he screamed. "Please, Mercy! Please! I'll do anything! I'll free all the slaves! I'll sell the plantation! Just let me go!" Mercy knelt beside him, her expression almost gentle. "If you would do all that now, in the face of death, why wouldn't you do it before? Why did it take my suffering, my near destruction, for you to even consider that we might be human?" She touched his face, and her hand was cold as January frost. "The answer is simple. You didn't care, and you never would have cared, not really. You would have lived your whole life in comfort, built on our pain, and you would have died believing you were a good man." The roots dragged Thomas to the edge of the shaft, and despite his desperate struggles, pushed him over. He fell screaming into the darkness, and the sound cut off abruptly when he hit bottom. Not dead, Mercy knew, but stunned, lying in a grave, not quite deep enough to kill, but deep enough to bury. William was next. He fought harder than his brother, landing several blows on Mercy that should have broken bones, but seemed to pass through her like she was made of smoke. His athletic build and youth gave him strength, but strength meant nothing here. The earth itself had become their enemy, and the earth was patient, powerful, and utterly without mercy. He fell into his shaft, howling curses, swearing vengeance, promising torture and death. But his threats echoed hollowly from the narrow grave, impotent and ignored. Jonathan stood paralyzed with terror, watching his sons disappear into the ground. When Mercy approached him, he didn't try to fight or run. He simply fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't understand. I didn't see. Please give me a chance to make it right." Mercy looked down at him, this man who had owned her since birth, who had controlled every aspect of her existence, who had the power to end her suffering at any moment, but chose not to. She felt no satisfaction in his tears, no triumph in his begging. She felt nothing except a vast, echoing emptiness where her humanity used to live. "You're not sorry for what you did," she said quietly. "You're sorry for what's happening to you. There's a difference." She gestured to his shaft. "Get in, or I'll ask the earth to put you there, and it won't be gentle." Jonathan Harroway, who had never taken an order from a slave in his life, crawled to the edge of his grave and lowered himself in. His bulk made the descent awkward, and he scraped his face against the walls, bloodying his nose and cheek. When he reached the bottom, he looked up at the circle of moonlight 8 feet above and began to pray in a voice choked with tears. That left Eleanor. The mistress of Harroway stood alone beneath the patriarch tree, her stolen voice making her pantomime of terror and pleading all the more pathetic. She fell to her knees, hands clasped in supplication, mouthing words that would never be heard. Mercy circled her slowly, studying the woman who had ordered her branded, who had watched the punishment with satisfaction, who had convinced herself that cruelty was righteousness when directed at those deemed lesser. "I could let you keep your voice," Mercy said finally, stopping in front of Eleanor. "I could let you scream and beg and explain why you thought burning my flesh was justified. But I've heard enough words from people like you, pretty words about civilization and order and God's will, all of them just decorations on a simple truth. You enjoyed it." Eleanor shook her head frantically, tears cutting tracks through her powder, but Mercy continued as if she hadn't seen. "You enjoyed having power over me, over all of us. It made you feel important in a world where your husband ignored you and your sons dismissed you. We were the only ones lower than you, so you pushed us down further just to feel tall." Mercy's voice remained calm, almost clinical. "I understand that now. Hurt people. But understanding doesn't mean forgiving." She gestured to the last remaining shaft. "Get in, mistress. It's time for you to learn what it feels like to be powerless, to be trapped, to be buried alive in a hole you can't escape while the world continues on above you, indifferent to your suffering. Eleanor collapsed completely, her body racked with silent sobs, her hands clawing at the dirt. But the earth beneath her began to shift, tilting, sliding her inexorably toward the opening. She tried to grip the grass, the roots, anything that might anchor her, but it all came loose in her hands as the ground delivered her to the lip of the grave. She looked up at Mercy one last time, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from truly understanding, for the first time, that you are not special, not protected, not exempt from the consequences of your actions. Then she fell. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. She lay at the bottom of the shaft, 8 feet down, in a space barely wide enough for her shoulders. When she looked up, Mercy's face appeared at the opening, silhouetted against the moon. "Now you wait," Mercy said. "Wait like I waited in that shed, wondering if anyone would come, if anyone cared enough to check if I was alive or dead. Wait and think about everything you've done, everyone you've hurt, all the suffering you caused because you could." Mercy stepped back from the edge, and for a moment the 4 Harroways thought this was the extent of their punishment. To be trapped in these holes, uncomfortable and terrified but alive. They would be discovered eventually. Dutch would organize a search. They would be freed. But then they heard it, the sound of shovels striking earth. From the shadows between the trees, figures emerged. 37 slaves, every soul from Harroway's quarters, walking in silence with tools in their hands. They had been waiting, watching, and now they came to complete the work that Mercy had begun. Old Isaiah led them, his weathered face set in an expression that held no joy, no satisfaction, only a grim determination to see justice done. Behind him came Ruth, came Samuel, came everyone who had witnessed Mercy's suffering, everyone who had lived their own version of it. They formed a circle around the 4 vertical graves, their presence casting shadows that stretched and merged in the moonlight. No one spoke. No one needed to. "Please!" Jonathan's voice echoed from his hole. "Ruth, Isaiah, you've known me for years. Don't do this. I'll free you all, I swear it. Just help us out of here." Isaiah looked down at him with eyes that had seen 4 masters come and go. "You've made that promise before, Master Harroway. Made it to my father when he saved your life during the fever. Made it to Ruth when she birthed your son safely. Made it to Samuel's wife before she died in childbirth because you wouldn't pay for a doctor." He spat into the hole. "Your promises don't mean nothing but more lies. You're murdering us," William shouted from his shaft. "You'll all hang for this." "Murder?" Mercy's voice cut through the night. "Is it murder when you work someone to death in your fields? Is it murder when you split up families, selling children away from their mothers? Is it murder when you beat a woman unconscious for moving too slow?" She shook her head. "No. You made those things legal. You wrote laws that said we weren't human, couldn't be murdered, couldn't testify against you. So this isn't murder, Master William. This is just a change in property ownership." She nodded to Isaiah, who raised his shovel. "The earth takes back what was stolen from it. The ground that drank our blood and sweat now gets to drink yours. And maybe, finally, something clean will grow here." The first shovelful of dirt hit Jonathan's upturned face. He sputtered, shaking his head, trying to wipe the clay from his eyes. "No, no, you can't." But another shovelful followed, then another. All around the circle, slaves began to work with the practiced efficiency of people who had spent their lives moving earth. They didn't hurry, they didn't celebrate. They simply filled the holes, one shovelful at a time, with the methodical patience of farmers planting seeds. Thomas was the first to panic. He screamed and thrashed, trying to climb the walls of his shaft, but the clay was too slick, too vertical. Every time he gained a few inches, he slid back down. The dirt began to accumulate around his feet, then his ankles, then his knees. He screamed until his voice went hoarse, until dirt filled his mouth and choked off the sound. William took a different approach. He cursed them, every one of them, promising elaborate tortures and divine retribution. But his theological arguments about property and natural order sounded increasingly hollow as the earth rose around him, as his privileged certainty was literally buried under the weight of consequence. Eleanor, voiceless, could only watch in silent horror as the moonlight above her slowly disappeared behind a growing mound of dirt. She tried to dig with her hands, throwing the earth back up, but for every handful she removed, 10 more fell from above. The futility of it broke something in her mind, and she simply collapsed against the wall, eyes open but unseeing, waiting for darkness to become permanent. Jonathan lasted the longest, his survival instinct overriding everything else. He stood on his toes as the dirt rose, keeping his face above it as long as possible, breathing through his nose, tilting his head back. He had stopped pleading, stopped promising. He simply fought for one more breath, then another, the way his slaves had fought every day of their lives, not because there was hope, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Mercy watched it all with an expression that might have been sadness or satisfaction or simply exhaustion. She stood perfectly still as the graves filled, as the sounds from below became muffled, then ceased entirely. When the last shovelful was patted down, when the earth was smooth and level, except for 4 slight mounds marking where the Harroways had been, she finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had done. The slaves stood in silence, shovels still in hand, looking at the freshly turned earth. No one celebrated, no one smiled. What had happened here was not victory. It was simply the end of a chapter written in blood and pain. "It's done," old Isaiah said quietly. He looked at Mercy with an expression that mixed fear, respect, and something like pity. "What happens now?" Mercy turned to face them all, these people who had been her community, her family in bondage. "Now you run," she said simply. "All of you. Take what you can carry and go north. The plantation will burn tonight, and when they come investigating, there can't be anyone here for them to blame." "What about you?" Ruth asked, her voice thick with emotion. "You coming with us?" Mercy shook her head slowly. "I'm not going north. I'm not going anywhere. I made a bargain to have this night to see justice done, but bargains with the kind of power I called on don't come free." She smiled faintly. "I'll be staying here, with them, in the ground. It's fitting." "Child, no." Ruth started forward, but Mercy raised a hand. "I died 3 days ago in that shed," Mercy said. "What's been walking around since then isn't really me anymore. It's something else, something that borrowed my face and my memories to do what needed doing. Now it's time to return what I borrowed." As if to emphasize her words, Mercy's form began to flicker slightly in the moonlight, becoming translucent for just a moment before solidifying again. The effect was subtle but undeniable. She was no longer entirely present in the physical world. "Go," she urged them. "Run while you still can. Tell people what happened here if you want, or don't. Either way, Harroway's legacy dies tonight." One by one, the slaves began to disperse, heading back to the quarters to gather what little they possessed before disappearing into the night. Some would make it north to freedom. Others would be caught by patrollers and return to slavery, though never again to Harroway. A few would simply vanish into the woods and countryside, becoming ghosts in their own right, living in the margins and empty spaces. Ruth was the last to leave. She approached Mercy and pulled her into an embrace, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry for everything that was done to you. Sorry I couldn't protect you. Sorry you had to become this." Mercy returned the embrace stiffly, her body feeling less solid by the moment. "Don't be sorry. You loved me the only way you could in a world designed to prevent love. That was enough. It had to be enough." Ruth pulled back, studying Mercy's face one last time. "Will you rest? After tonight, will you finally have peace?" "I don't know," Mercy admitted. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll walk these grounds forever, a reminder of what happens when suffering becomes too great to contain. Either way, it doesn't matter anymore. Ruth nodded, kissed Mercy's forehead, and walked away into the darkness, her figure soon swallowed by shadows and distance. Mercy stood alone in the orchard, surrounded by 4 fresh graves and old apple trees that had fed on suffering for 3 decades. She could feel the pull now, the bargain demanding payment, the darkness in the lightning-struck oak calling her home. But she had one more task to complete. She walked back to the main house, her footsteps leaving no prints in the soft earth. The mansion stood empty now, all its occupants gone, some to death, others to flight. It was just a building, she realized. Wood and brick and glass. All the power it had held over her, all the fear it had inspired, had come not from the structure itself, but from the people who inhabited it. Now, those people were gone, and the house was just a house. Mercy walked through the rooms, her chains scraping against floorboards that no longer bent to accommodate her. She moved through the parlor where Eleanor had served tea to other plantation wives, discussing the servant problem over delicate china. Through the study where Jonathan had calculated the value of human lives in dollar amounts, through Thomas's room where he had written those disturbing journal entries, through every space that had been forbidden to her, every room where she had cleaned and served without being truly seen. In the kitchen, she found what she needed. The oil they used for the lamps, gallons of it stored in ceramic jugs. She began to pour it throughout the house, creating trails from room to room, soaking curtains and furniture, making sure the entire structure would burn quickly and completely. When the jugs were empty, she stood in the foyer one last time, looking around at the monument to Southern gentility that had been built on a foundation of stolen labor and broken lives. "Ashes," she said to the empty house. "That's all you deserve. Ashes and memory, and a warning to anyone else who thinks they can build heaven on someone else's hell." She struck a match, taken from Jonathan's study where he lit his evening cigars, and dropped it onto an oil-soaked rug. The flame caught instantly, spreading with eager hunger across the floor, up the walls, racing through the house like it had been waiting for this moment. Mercy walked out the front door and down the steps, not looking back as the fire grew behind her, as smoke began to pour from windows, as the entire structure became an enormous torch visible for miles. She walked to the orchard, to the lightning-struck oak that had been her altar and her gateway. The 4 graves lay peaceful in the moonlight, the earth already settling, already beginning the process of forgetting. Mercy knelt at the base of the oak, in front of the altar of bones and stones that was still there untouched. She could feel herself coming apart now, the borrowed time running out, the power that had sustained her for 3 days demanding its due. "I kept my part," she said to the darkness in the tree. "The debt is paid." They understood at the end. They felt what we felt. They died knowing they were wrong. The darkness seemed to pulse, acknowledging her words. Then a voice emerged from the hollow, ancient and vast, speaking in that language older than English, older than Christianity, older than the borders that divided humans from each other. The voice said, "The debt is paid. But the cost was your humanity, child. You touched power not meant for mortal hands, and it changed you. You can never go back to what you were." "I know," Mercy whispered. "I knew when I called you, but it was worth it. They needed to understand. Someone needed to make them understand." "Then rest," the voice said, and suddenly Mercy felt exhausted, more tired than she had ever been in her short, brutal life. "Rest here, in the earth you blessed with justice. Rest, and let the weight of vengeance finally be lifted." Mercy lay down at the base of the oak, her body finally succumbing to the injuries that should have killed her days ago. She looked up through the branches at the stars beyond, so distant and cold, and indifferent to human suffering. Behind her the plantation house burned, flames climbing into the night sky. turning darkness into flickering orange light. She thought about her mother, about her father, about all the people who had suffered and died on this land. She hoped they could rest easier now, knowing that at least once the scales had balanced. The debt had been paid. As her eyes closed for the final time, she heard singing, the old spirituals, the ones that spoke of crossing over, of laying down burdens, of going home at last. She couldn't tell if the voices were real or memory, if the slaves were singing as they fled to freedom, or if she was simply hearing echoes of songs sung over decades of labor and loss. Either way, the music carried her down into darkness, and this time the darkness was not punishment, but peace. By dawn, Harroway plantation was gone. The main house had burned to its foundation, leaving only blackened brick and twisted metal. The flames had spread to the tobacco barn and some of the outbuildings, though the slave quarters, by some miracle, remained untouched. The slaves themselves had vanished, every one of them, disappearing into the night like smoke on the wind. When neighbors arrived to investigate the fire, they found no bodies in the ruins, which struck them as strange. Surely the Harroways had been home. Where had they gone? But search parties found no trace of the family, and the slaves who might have explained what happened were nowhere to be found. In the orchard, they discovered 4 fresh graves marked only by slight mounds of earth. When they excavated the sites, they found the Harroway family buried in vertical shafts, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, dirt in their mouths and lungs, hands bloodied from clawing at the walls. The authorities called it murder, of course, runaway slaves exacting revenge. A massive manhunt was organized, with rewards offered for the capture of anyone from Harroway's quarters, but the slaves had scattered too widely, moved too quickly, most were never found. And there was something else, something that made even hardened slave catchers reluctant to search too thoroughly. At the base of the old oak in the orchard, they found a body. A young girl, 17 years old, wearing a torn dress and bearing the mark of the Harroway brand on her shoulder. Mercy. But here was the strange part, the detail that would fuel whispers and speculation for decades. She'd been dead for at least a week, the coroner determined. Her wounds, the lash marks, the brand, various other injuries, had become infected, causing sepsis that must have killed her days ago. Yet witnesses from neighboring plantations swore they had seen her on the night of the fire, walking through the flames as the main house burned, swore they had seen her face in the smoke, heard her voice in the crackling of burning wood. The official report called these witnesses mistaken, victims of superstition and poor lighting. The official report said that slaves had murdered the Harroway family and fled, leaving behind one of their own, who had died from infected injuries sustained during punishment. But the unofficial stories, the ones told in whispers over midnight fires, in coded songs and hushed warnings, told a different tale. They said that Mercy had died in that punishment shed, had called on something old and dark for the strength to exact one final vengeance. They said her spirit still walked the ruins of Harroway plantation, that on certain nights you could see a girl in chains standing among the apple trees, watching, waiting, reminding everyone who passed that debts of blood must eventually be paid. The land itself seemed to agree. After the fire, after the bodies were removed and buried in a proper cemetery, though many argued the Harroways deserved no such dignity, the property was put up for sale. But no buyers came forward. The few who expressed interest reported strange occurrences during their visits, sounds of chains dragging across floors, the smell of burning flesh, shadows that moved wrong, and an overwhelming sense of being watched by eyes full of justified rage. Eventually, the land was abandoned, left to grow wild. The apple trees in the orchard withered and died within a year, though the soil was rich and the climate perfect for growing. Nothing would take root in that earth, as if the ground itself had rejected any possibility of life after drinking so much death. The old oak remained, though, the lightning-struck patriarch, hollow and twisted, standing sentinel over the unmarked grave where Mercy's body had been found. Local children dared each other to approach it, but few made it all the way. There was something about that tree, something that made the air feel heavy and watched, something that whispered warnings in a voice too old to fully comprehend. Years passed. The Civil War came and went, slavery ended, and the world changed in ways both profound and superficial. But the story of Mercy and Harroway plantation endured, passed down through generations, evolving with each telling but maintaining its essential truth. That there are limits to what humans can endure, and when those limits are exceeded, the universe itself sometimes intervenes to restore balance. And on summer nights, when the moon is full and the air is thick with heat and humidity, people living near the ruins of Harroway swear they can still hear it. The sound of chains scraping against wood, the echo of a young voice singing songs of sorrow and freedom, and the gentle crackling of a fire that never quite goes out, burning forever in memory of the night when one girl's suffering finally, terribly, ended. 3 months after the Harroway fire, strange occurrences began spreading across Georgia's plantation country like a fever. In Milledgeville, 30 miles east of the ruins, a slave trader named Ezekiel Walsh woke screaming in the middle of the night, claiming that a girl in chains had stood at the foot of his bed, watching him with eyes that reflected no light. His wife dismissed it as a nightmare brought on by bad oysters, but Walsh knew better. He recognized the description from the wanted posters still circulating. Mercy, the Harroway girl, the one who had supposedly been dead for days before the murders. He sold his slaves the next morning at a significant loss and invested in textile manufacturing instead, never again involving himself in human trafficking. When pressed by business associates about his sudden change of heart, he would only say that he'd seen something that convinced him to pursue other ventures. At the Blackwood plantation, 40 miles north, an overseer named Silas Crane disappeared one October evening. He had been known throughout the county for his particular cruelty, for innovations in punishment that made even other overseers uncomfortable. His specialty was the sweat box, a coffin-sized wooden box left in direct sun where recalcitrant slaves would be confined for hours, sometimes days. When they found Crane 3 days later, he was inside his own sweat box, nailed shut from the outside, his hands bloodied from clawing at the lid, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. On the outside of the box, carved in letters that looked like they'd been made with fingernails rather than tools, was a single word: mercy. The slaves at Blackwood claimed ignorance. None had seen anything, heard anything. But that night, the spirituals they sang had a different quality to them. Not quite celebration, but a grim satisfaction, an acknowledgement that sometimes the universe did provide a form of justice, however dark. These incidents might have been dismissed as coincidence or the work of abolitionists, except for one disturbing pattern. Witnesses, when they could be found, always described seeing a young girl, 17 years old, wearing a torn dress and bearing a brand mark on her shoulder. She never spoke to anyone except her victims. She simply appeared, a harbinger of consequence, and then terrible things would happen to those who had built their fortunes on suffering. Reverend Patterson, the same minister who had blessed Eleanor Harroway's house, found himself unable to ignore the pattern. He began a private investigation, interviewing witnesses, collecting testimonies, trying to understand what was happening across the region. His findings troubled him deeply. Every victim, and by December there had been 7 confirmed cases, shared common characteristics. They had been particularly cruel to their slaves, had committed acts that went beyond the normal brutalities of the institution, had taken some kind of pleasure in the suffering they caused, and in each case their punishment was tailored to their crime. Walsh, who had separated countless families, had woken to find photographs of his own wife and children missing from their frames, replaced by images of slaves he had sold, their faces accusing. The photographs reappeared the next morning, but the message was clear. Crane, who had used the sweatbox, had died in one. A plantation mistress named Catherine Drummond, known for using a branding iron on slaves who stole scraps from her kitchen, had been found in her parlor with both hands thrust into her fireplace, held there by some invisible force until they burned to the bone. She survived barely, but never used her hands again and never stopped screaming at night. "It's judgment," Reverend Patterson wrote in his private journal, which would be discovered decades later in the basement of Milledgeville's First Baptist Church. Not justice as we understand it in our courts of law, but something older, more fundamental. The slaves call her the mercy ghost, and they say she walks for those who died unheard, who suffered unseen, who were buried in unmarked graves with no one to remember their names. But the spreading influence of Mercy's vengeance created unexpected consequences. As word traveled through the slave communities, passed along in songs, in stories, in the coded language that masters never quite learned to decipher, something shifted in the collective consciousness of the enslaved. Fear, it turned out, could flow both ways. At the Crawford plantation in Augusta, an overseer named Thomas Green raised his whip to strike a field hand who had slowed in his work. Before the lash could fall, every slave in the field stopped working simultaneously and turned to face him. They didn't threaten. They didn't move closer. They simply stared with expressions that said, clearly, "We know what happened at Harroway. We know she's out there, and we know what happens to men like you." Green lowered his whip. For the first time in 15 years as an overseer, he walked away from an act of disobedience without punishing it. The balance of terror had shifted, just slightly, but enough to matter. Not every plantation owner or overseer was affected by conscience or fear. Some doubled down, increasing punishments, tightening control, as if brutality could somehow insulate them from consequence. But these men found themselves facing a more practical problem. Their slaves were running away in unprecedented numbers. The Underground Railroad, that network of safe houses and secret routes to freedom, had always existed. But in late 1841 and early 1842, it experienced a surge of traffic, unlike anything conductors had seen before. Slaves who had been too frightened to run, who had accepted their fate as inevitable, suddenly found courage in the story of a girl who had refused to accept her own destruction. "She gave them hope," wrote Frederick Bailey, not yet calling himself Douglas, in a letter to a fellow abolitionist. "Not the hope of rescue or salvation from outside, but the hope that comes from seeing one of your own refuse to break. They say she died, yes, but died on her feet, with her tormentors buried and her oppressors scattered. That's a powerful story, dangerous but powerful." In the white communities of Georgia, a different conversation was taking place. Some dismissed the incidents as superstitious nonsense, the work of abolitionists or vengeful slaves, using the mercy story as cover for their crimes. But others, particularly those who dealt directly with slaves, couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. "They look at us differently now," wrote Margaret Thornton, mistress of the Thornton plantation, in a letter to her sister in Charleston, "not with the same resignation. There's something in their eyes I've never seen before. Not quite defiance, but an awareness that our authority over them is not absolute, not guaranteed. It's unnerving." She was right to be unnerved. The social order that had maintained itself through overwhelming force and psychological domination was experiencing its first hairline cracks. The story of Mercy, whether she was ghost, legend, or something in between, had introduced an idea that was genuinely dangerous to the entire system, that there were limits to what could be done to human beings, and exceeding those limits carried consequences. Back at the ruins of Harroway plantation, strange phenomena continued. The land had been officially abandoned, too tainted by tragedy and rumor to sell, but people still visited, drawn by morbid curiosity or deeper need. Escaped slaves, making their way north, would sometimes detour to see the place where Mercy had exacted her revenge. They would stand among the dead apple trees and the blackened foundation, and they would pray or sing or simply bear witness. Some left offerings at the base of the lightning-struck oak, flowers, small carved figures, locks of hair. The oak became a shrine of sorts, an unofficial monument to all those who had died in bondage, with Mercy as their avatar. One night in February 1842, a young slave woman named Hannah arrived at the ruins. She had run from a plantation in South Carolina after her master had sold her children. She had been traveling for 3 weeks, moving only at night, surviving on roots and whatever she could steal from gardens. She was exhausted, starving, and close to giving up. She knelt at the oak, tears streaming down her face, and spoke to the darkness. "They say you hear," she whispered. "They say you walk for those who can't. I don't know if it's true, but I got nowhere else to turn. My babies are gone. I'm going to die out here. But if you're real, if you're listening, please, don't let what happened to me happen to anyone else. Make them pay. Make them all pay." The night was still, the winter air cold and sharp. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, slowly, Hannah became aware that she was not alone. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the starlight. Young, female, wearing a dress that moved wrong in the breeze, as if it were made of something other than fabric. Hannah couldn't see her face clearly, but she didn't need to. She knew who this was. "I can't save your children." Mercy's voice drifted across the clearing, and it sounded like wind through hollow spaces. "What's done is done, but I can show you the way north. And I can make sure the man who took them remembers what he did, every day, for the rest of his life." "How?" Hannah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "His name. Give me his name, and the name of his plantation. I'll do the rest." Hannah provided the information, speaking through tears. When she finished, Mercy nodded slowly. "There's a farmhouse 3 miles north," Mercy said. "The family there doesn't hold with slavery. They'll feed you, give you clothes, put you on the railroad. Tell them the Mercy ghost sent you. They'll understand." "Are you real?" Hannah asked suddenly. "Or am I just so far gone that I'm imagining this?" Mercy was silent for a moment. "Does it matter? You needed help. You're going to get it. Whether I'm a ghost or a dream or something else entirely, the result is the same. You survive. You make it north. You live." "What about you?" Hannah stood on shaking legs. "Do you ever rest?" "I'll rest when every last person who profits from this horror understands what they've done. Until then, I walk. I watch. I remember the names of those who were forgotten." Mercy turned slightly, and for just a moment moonlight caught her face, revealing eyes that held centuries of sorrow. "Now go. Run fast and far. And when you get to freedom, tell them what you saw here. Tell them that debts get paid one way or another." Hannah ran, following Mercy's directions, and found the farmhouse exactly where she had been told. The family there, Quakers who ran a station on the Underground Railroad, welcomed her without question. When she told them the Mercy ghost had sent her, they simply nodded. "You're the third this month," the woman of the house said quietly. "She's been sending people to us, the ones who are most desperate, most in need. We don't know what she is, but we trust her judgment. She only sends the ones who truly can't survive on their own." Hannah made it to Philadelphia by March. She never saw her children again, but she survived, built a life, and eventually became a conductor herself, helping others escape. And every person she helped, she told them about Mercy, not to frighten them, but to give them strength, to show them that even in the darkest circumstances, resistance was possible. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, Hannah's former master, a man named Robert Carlyle, experienced a sudden and dramatic change in fortune. His slaves, previously docile, became accident-prone. Equipment broke, crops failed. Small fires started and were extinguished just before spreading. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that could be traced to deliberate sabotage, but a steady accumulation of setbacks that slowly destroyed his wealth. And every night, Carlyle dreamed of 3 children crying for their mother, their faces accusing, their voices asking him the same question over and over. Why? Why did you take us from her? What gave you the right? He lasted 6 months before selling his plantation and moving to Atlanta, trying to escape the guilt that followed him like a shadow. But the dreams never stopped. They followed him to his new home, invaded his waking hours until he could barely function. He died in 1844, technically of heart failure, but everyone who knew him said he had looked haunted in his final years, like a man being slowly consumed from the inside out. The pattern repeated across the South. Those who had been particularly cruel found their lives touched by inexplicable misfortune. Nothing so dramatic as the Harroway killings. Mercy seemed to have learned that subtlety often worked better than spectacle, but persistent, relentless consequence that ground down their certainty and prosperity. Some learned. They freed their slaves, or at least treated them more humanely, hoping to escape whatever curse had marked the truly brutal. Others dismissed it as coincidence and continued as before, usually to their eventual regret. But the most significant impact wasn't on individual plantations or masters. It was on the institution itself. The story of mercy, spreading through both slave and white communities, introduced a crack in the psychological foundation that kept the system functioning. Masters who had previously felt entitled to absolute control now felt watched, judged, potentially accountable. Slaves who had previously felt powerless now knew that even if they couldn't fight back themselves, someone, something, was fighting on their behalf. By late 1842, the American South was experiencing what historians would later call a crisis of confidence in the slave system. It wasn't enough to end slavery, that wouldn't come for another 2 decades, but it was enough to make the institution unstable in ways it hadn't been before. Slave rebellions increased, escapes multiplied. And crucially, a growing number of white Southerners began questioning whether the economic benefits of slavery were worth the moral and supernatural costs that seemed to be accumulating. Reverend Patterson, still investigating the phenomena, wrote in his journal, "I have come to believe that mercy, whether ghost, legend, or mass delusion, serves a necessary function. She is the embodiment of accumulated debt, the physical manifestation of what we owe to those we have brutalized. We can dismiss her as superstition, but we cannot escape the simple truth she represents, that every action has consequences, every cruelty leaves a mark, and the universe itself seems to demand some form of balance." He closed his investigation in December 1842, not because he had found definitive answers, but because he realized the questions themselves were more important than any conclusion he might reach. He began preaching against slavery, losing half his congregation in the process, but gaining a clarity of purpose he had never experienced before. "She saved me," he would say years later, after the Civil War, when he was an old man reflecting on his life. Not mercy herself, but what she represented. She showed me that remaining complicit in evil is itself a form of evil, and that eventually we all have to choose what side we're on when the reckoning comes. Back at the ruins of Harroway, the shrine at the lightning-struck oak continued to grow. More offerings appeared, not just from escaped slaves, but from freedmen who had heard the story, from abolitionists who saw mercy as a martyr, even from some whites who had lost faith in the system they had been born into. The oak itself seemed to thrive despite the dead soil around it. Its twisted trunk remained solid. Its branches continued to grow, as if feeding on something other than sunlight and water. On certain nights, people reported seeing a faint glow emanating from the hollow in its trunk, and if you stood close enough, you could hear singing. Not the spirituals exactly, but something older, something that predated the English language and the Christianity imposed by masters. Some said it was the sound of Africa remembering itself. Others said it was the earth itself mourning. A few claimed it was simply wind through the hollow oak, and that humans had a tendency to hear patterns in random noise. But those who had actually experienced loss, who had felt the weight of injustice, who understood what it meant to be powerless in the face of cruelty, they knew better. They heard the singing and recognized it for what it was, a promise that suffering would be remembered, that the dead would be honored, and that someday, somehow, the scales would balance. By the spring of 1843, the story of mercy had evolved beyond the bounds of Georgia. It traveled north with escaped slaves, south through whispered conversations between house servants, west with traders and travelers who had heard the tales in taverns and general stores. Each telling added new details, embellishments that made the story larger than life, but the core remained consistent. A girl who had died, refusing to be broken, who walked still as a reminder that cruelty had costs. In Boston, abolitionists printed pamphlets about mercy. Though they argued fiercely about how to frame the story, some wanted to emphasize her victimhood, to use her suffering as evidence of slavery's moral bankruptcy. Others preferred to highlight her resistance, her refusal to accept her fate. A few worried that celebrating violence, even retributive violence, might undermine their message of peaceful reform. Frederick Douglass, now escaped and speaking publicly about his experiences, addressed the controversy in a speech at Faneuil Hall. Some ask whether we should celebrate this girl's vengeance, whether it serves our cause to speak of masters buried alive and plantations burned. I say this: we did not make this system violent. We did not choose brutality as our method. That was chosen for us, imposed upon us, used against us for generations. If now the violence returns to its source, if the architects of cruelty finally taste what they have been feeding others, who are we to condemn the universe for seeking balance? His words were controversial, rejected by the more conservative abolitionists, but embraced by those who had themselves escaped slavery and understood the rage that mercy represented. The debate split the movement, creating factions that would persist until the Civil War finally settled the question through force of arms. But in the South, where the story mattered most, something stranger was happening. Mercy was becoming more than a ghost story or cautionary tale. She was becoming a folk saint, an intercessor between the powerless and justice. Slaves began invoking her name in their prayers, not to God, but alongside him, as if she occupied some intermediate space between the human and the divine. "Mercy, hear me," they would whisper in the darkness of their cabins. "Mercy, remember me. Mercy, don't let them forget what they've done." And sometimes, not always, but often enough to be noted, something would answer. At the Henderson plantation outside Savannah, a slave named Marcus was accused of theft by the overseer, a false charge meant to justify a punishment the overseer wanted to inflict for personal reasons. Marcus was locked in the smokehouse overnight, to be whipped publicly the next morning as an example. That night, Marcus prayed. He had never been particularly religious, had lost faith in a God that would allow his people to suffer so completely. But he had heard the stories about mercy, about how she walked for those who called her name with genuine need. "Mercy," he whispered in the darkness. "If you're real, if you hear prayers like they say, I'm asking for help, not for revenge. Just let them know the truth. Let somebody see that I didn't do what they're saying." The next morning, when they came to fetch Marcus for his punishment, they found the overseer unconscious on the ground outside the smokehouse, his head bloodied from a fall. When he woke, he was confused, disoriented, and kept insisting that he had been writing in his journal when something had struck him from behind. The journal was found next to him, open to a page dated the previous night. In the overseer's own handwriting was a detailed confession. He had planted the stolen items in Marcus's cabin, had fabricated the theft to justify a whipping he wanted to administer. The entry was signed and dated, undeniably authentic. The overseer had no memory of writing it, claimed he had been attacked before he could write anything, but there it was, in his hand, impossible to deny. Marcus was released, the overseer was dismissed, and that night, in the slave quarters, the spirituals carried a different tone, not quite celebration, but acknowledgement that sometimes prayers were answered, justice was served, truth was revealed. These incidents accumulated. Not every prayer was answered. Mercy was selective, responding only to the most desperate, the most unjust situations. But enough prayers were answered that a pattern emerged, a system of checks and balances that operated outside the legal structures that had been designed to protect masters and condemn slaves. The phenomenon began to attract attention from sources beyond the plantation system. Academic folklorists traveled to Georgia to interview witnesses. Skeptics arrived determined to debunk the stories. Spiritualists claimed mercy was proof of their theories about the persistence of consciousness after death. One such investigator was Dr. Elias Whitmore, a professor of theology from Harvard who arrived in Milledgeville in June 1843 with the stated goal of applying rational inquiry to irrational beliefs. He interviewed dozens of witnesses, examined the ruins of Harroway plantation, and compiled extensive notes on the various incidents attributed to Mercy's influence. His published paper, The Mercy Phenomenon, Mass Delusion and Social Unrest in the American South, argued that the entire affair was a collective psychological response to the stresses of the slave system. There was no ghost, he concluded, only a convenient fiction that allowed both slaves and masters to externalize their guilt and fear. But Dr. Whitmore's certainty was shaken during his final night in Georgia. He had decided to spend the night at the ruins of Harroway, partly to prove his own courage, partly to observe the location during the hours when sightings were most commonly reported. He brought a colleague, Dr. Samuel Morton, to serve as a witness to whatever they might or might not experience. They set up camp near the lightning-struck oak, building a small fire and preparing to maintain watch through the night. For the first few hours, nothing happened. They sat in companionable silence, occasionally recording observations about temperature, wind direction, and other environmental factors. Then, around 2 in the morning, the air changed. Dr. Whitmore would later struggle to describe the sensation accurately. It wasn't that the temperature dropped, though it did feel suddenly colder. It wasn't that sound ceased, though the normal night sounds of insects and small animals did go quiet. It was more fundamental, a shift in the quality of reality itself, as if the boundary between the physical world and something else had grown temporarily thin. "Do you feel that?" Morton whispered, and Whitmore nodded, unable to speak. A figure emerged from the shadows near the oak, young, female, wearing a dress that seemed to be made partially of darkness itself. She didn't walk so much as manifest, appearing progressively more solid as she approached their fire. Doctor Whitmore's rational mind tried to find explanations. A local woman playing a prank, his own fatigue creating hallucinations, some natural phenomenon he didn't understand. But none of these explanations could account for what he saw next. The figure stopped at the edge of their firelight, and when the flames illuminated her face, Whitmore gasped. She'd been dead for years. He had seen the coroner's report, had visited her grave. Yet here she stood, solid enough to cast a shadow, real enough that he could see the brand mark on her shoulder, the evidence of old whip scars on her exposed arms. "Dr. Whitmore," Mercy said, and her voice was wrong. Too many voices speaking in unison, human and not human. "You came here to prove I don't exist, to write a paper that would explain me away as delusion and mass hysteria. You came here certain that reason and education could protect you from uncomfortable truths." Whitmore tried to respond, but found his voice had abandoned him entirely. "Let me show you something," Mercy continued. She raised her hand, and the air between them rippled like disturbed water. Images began to form, not quite solid, but more real than mere imagination. Whitmore saw a woman on a whipping post, her back being methodically destroyed, saw children torn from their mother's arms, sold to different buyers, sent in different directions, saw a man worked to death in a rice field, his body left where it fell until the overseer decided it was convenient to remove it, saw 100,000 moments of casual cruelty, systematic dehumanization, violence so normalized it had become invisible to those who perpetrated it. "This is what you're trying to explain away," Mercy said softly. "This is what your rational inquiry seeks to minimize. You want to write a paper that makes comfortable people feel better about uncomfortable truths. You want to transform suffering into statistics, horror into hypothesis, my death into an interesting case study." The images faded, and Whitmore found himself weeping, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Beside him, Morton had collapsed entirely, curled into a ball, hands over his eyes. "I don't exist to satisfy your curiosity," Mercy said. "I exist because the universe itself couldn't tolerate the imbalance anymore. I exist because someone had to remember all the forgotten names, all the unmarked graves, all the suffering that was dismissed as necessary or natural or justified. You can write your paper, Doctor. You can explain me away to people who need that comfort. But you'll know the truth. You'll carry it with you for the rest of your life." She turned to leave, then paused. "Tell them this. If you tell them anything, Mercy isn't just my name. It's what you all should have shown while you had the chance. Now it's too late for mercy. Now there's only consequence." She dissolved back into shadow, and the normal sounds of night gradually returned. Whitmore and Morton sat by their dying fire until dawn, neither speaking, both lost in thoughts too large and terrible for words. Dr. Whitmore never published his paper. He returned to Harvard, resigned his position, and spent the remaining years of his life working for the abolition movement. When people asked what had changed his mind, he would only say that he had encountered something in Georgia that made him reconsider the nature of justice and the cost of complicity. Dr. Morton, meanwhile, suffered a complete nervous breakdown and spent 6 months in a sanitarium. He recovered physically, but never spoke again about what he had seen at Harroway. He took his own life in 1847, leaving behind a note that read simply, "I can't carry what I saw. I can't unsee what she showed me. Forgive me." These darker aspects of Mercy's influence were rarely discussed in public discourse. The abolitionists preferred to emphasize her victimhood and resistance. The slaves preferred to see her as a protector and avenger. But those who had actually encountered her directly, who had looked into her eyes and felt the weight of what she represented, understood that she was something more complex and troubling than either narrative allowed. She was not simply good or evil. She was consequence incarnate, the physical manifestation of debts that had accumulated over generations. She was what happened when suffering exceeded all reasonable bounds, when cruelty became so normalized that only something supernatural could make people see it for what it was. As 1843 turned to 1844, the incidents attributed to Mercy began to decrease. Not because she had grown tired or weak, but because her influence had already changed things in ways both visible and subtle. Plantations that had been sites of extreme cruelty had either reformed or collapsed. Masters who had been particularly brutal had died, gone mad or fled. The most egregious practices, the torture disguised as punishment, the sexual violence treated as privilege, the family separations done for profit rather than necessity, had become less common, not because hearts had changed, but because fear had entered the equation. The system of slavery continued, of course. It would take a civil war and 600,000 deaths to finally end it. But the absolute certainty that had allowed the system to function smoothly had been compromised. Masters who had previously felt entitled to treat their human property however they wished, now felt watched, judged, potentially accountable to forces beyond human law. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to balance the scales of centuries of brutality. But it was something, a crack in the foundation that would eventually widen into collapse. At Harroway's ruins, the shrine continued to grow. The lightning-struck oak became a pilgrimage site for escaped slaves heading north, for freedmen visiting to pay respects, for anyone who needed to remember that resistance was possible even in impossible circumstances. Offerings accumulated at its base, flowers that never quite wilted, small carved figures, letters written to Mercy asking for help or guidance. Some claimed the oak answered prayers, others said it simply listened, which was perhaps more important. In a world where slaves were denied voice, denied personhood, denied acknowledgement of their suffering, having a place that listened, even if it was just a tree, carried profound significance. In the winter of 1844, an elderly woman arrived at the ruins. Her name was Sarah Blackwood, and she had been born in Africa 80 years earlier, brought to America on a slave ship when she was just a child. She had survived the Middle Passage, survived decades of bondage, outlived 3 masters and 4 plantations. Now, having purchased her freedom through 40 years of saving every penny she could hide, she had come to Harroway on what she knew would be her final journey. She knelt at the base of the oak with a grace that belied her age, placing her weathered hands on the bark. "I knew your grandmother," she said softly, speaking in the old language, the tongue of their ancestors. "Taught her the prayers, the protections, the ways of calling on the old powers when all else failed. She taught your mother taught you, and you—" She paused, her voice breaking. "You did what none of us had the strength to do. You said no. You made them pay. You reminded the world that we are human, and that humans have limits to what they can endure." She was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the bark. Old symbols, protective marks, blessings in a language that predated English and Christianity, and all the ways the masters had tried to remake their captives in more convenient forms. "I'm dying," Sarah continued, "can feel it in my bones, in my breath. Before I go, I wanted to come here, to this place where you made your stand, wanted to leave something for you, for all of us." From a pouch at her waist, she withdrew a small object, a carved wooden figure, no longer than her thumb, depicting a woman with chains around her ankles and fire in her eyes. It was incredibly old, the wood darkened with age, the details worn smooth by countless hands. "This belonged to my mother in Africa," Sarah said. "She gave it to me on the ship, told me it was a goddess of justice and vengeance, a spirit who walked for those who couldn't. I carried it through everything, the passage, the auction block, decades in the fields. It gave me strength when I had none. Now, I give it to you, sister. May it connect your fight to all the fights that came before, to all the women who said no in whatever small ways they could." She placed the figurine carefully at the base of the oak, among the other offerings. Then she sang, a song in her mother's language, a song of mourning and celebration, a song that honored both the dead and the living, those who had fallen and those who still fought. When the song ended, Sarah stood with effort, her knees protesting, her back bent with age. She placed her hand on the oak one final time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for remembering, for refusing, for showing them that we are not things to be owned, but humans to be reckoned with. She turned to leave, but before she took her first step, she felt it, a presence at her back, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. She didn't turn around, didn't need to. She knew who stood behind her. "The old ways are dying," Mercy's voice said softly. "The language, the prayers, the knowledge. When you pass, there will be fewer still who remember." "Yes," Sarah agreed, "but we're not gone yet. And as long as even one person remembers, the connection holds. The chain remains unbroken, from Africa to here, from then to now, from the dead to the living." "Will they win?" Mercy asked. "The masters, the system, the cruelty?" Sarah considered this carefully. "They'll lose eventually. Don't know when, don't know how, but I feel it in my bones. This world they've built on our backs, it's not sustainable. Towers built on suffering always fall, child, always. It's just a matter of time and how many more people get crushed when it comes down." She started walking then, making her way slowly across the ruined plantation toward the road that would take her home. She died 3 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the grandchildren she had saved 40 years to purchase free. At her funeral, attended by freedmen and escaped slaves and a few white abolitionists who had respected her wisdom, they sang the old songs. And though the words were in English now, filtered through Christianity and adapted to circumstances their African ancestors could never have imagined, the spirit was the same: defiance, endurance, a refusal to be erased or forgotten. That night, at the Harroway ruins, the small wooden figurine Sarah had left began to glow with a faint light, warm as a candle flame. It would glow every night thereafter, becoming part of the shrine's legend, a light that never went out, fueled by something that had nothing to do with fire or electricity. Pilgrims began to say that if you watched that light long enough, you could see images in it, faces of the forgotten, names of the unnamed, stories of those who had died without witnesses. Some claimed the light showed them their own ancestors, connecting them to a past that had been deliberately obscured, systematically destroyed. Whether these visions were real or the product of hope and grief was beside the point. The light served a purpose. It reminded people that they came from somewhere, that they were part of a chain that stretched back across an ocean and through centuries, that their suffering was real and witnessed and remembered even when the official histories pretended it had never happened. As the years passed, as the political situation in America grew more tense, as the question of slavery pushed the nation toward civil war, the story of Mercy continued to evolve. She became a symbol, invoked by both sides. Abolitionists used her to illustrate the moral bankruptcy of slavery. Pro-slavery advocates pointed to her as evidence of why strict control was necessary. But for the people who had actually known her, who had lived on Harroway, who had witnessed her suffering and her vengeance, she was something else entirely. A reminder that every person has a breaking point, and that breaking points, when reached, transform the world in ways that can never be undone. Old Isaiah, who had survived Harroway and made it north to Philadelphia, told her story to anyone who would listen. He was nearly 80 now, his body worn down by decades of labor, his mind still sharp as broken glass. "People ask me if I'm glad she did what she did," he would say. "If I think the killing was justified, I tell them they're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether she was justified. The question is what the Harroways and people like them created when they pushed suffering past endurance. They made her into what she became. They planted seeds of violence and were surprised when violence grew." He would pause, his ancient eyes reflecting memories of fire and chains and a girl who refused to die quietly. She didn't choose vengeance. Vengeance was chosen for her, forced on her, the only option left after every other path had been closed. You want to judge her? Fine. But judge the system that made her first. Judge the masters who thought they could break humans without consequence. Judge the laws and the churches and the society that said it was all acceptable because we had darker skin. Isaiah died in 1851, just 10 years before the Civil War that would finally, bloodily settle the question of slavery. His last words, witnessed by his granddaughter, were in the old language. Tell Mercy we did what we could. Tell her the fight continues. Tell her we haven't forgotten. And whether Mercy heard those words, whether she walked still in the ruins of Harroway or had finally found rest, was something no one could say for certain. But on the night Isaiah died, people visiting the shrine reported that the light in Sarah's figurine burned brighter than ever, and the singing from the hollow oak seemed to carry words in multiple languages, a chorus of the dead and the living joined together in one continuous song of resistance and remembrance. The story was not over, would never truly be over as long as humans were capable of cruelty and others were capable of remembering it. But a chapter had closed, a testament written in blood and fire, and the stubborn refusal of one girl to accept that her suffering was inevitable or meaningless. She had shown them what they were, had forced them to see what they had made, and whether they learned from it or not, whether they changed or continued in their brutality, the knowledge was now part of the collective consciousness, impossible to completely erase. Mercy's revenge was not just in the deaths of the Harroways, not just in the fear she had sown among slaveholders. Her true revenge was in the stories, in the remembered names, in the light that would not go out, in the chains that rattled in the night as a reminder that nothing stays buried forever, that debts always come due, and that those who profit from suffering always, eventually, pay the price. The winter of 1860 brought snow to Georgia, a rare occurrence that blanketed the red clay in pristine white, transforming the landscape into something almost peaceful. But beneath that false tranquility, the nation was tearing itself apart. Abraham Lincoln had been elected president in November. South Carolina had seceded in December. War was coming. Everyone could feel it in the air, in the increasing polarization of conversations, in the way men checked their weapons and spoke in low voices about honor and rights and the preservation of their way of life. The ruins of Harroway plantation still stood, or rather still lay, scattered across what had been productive acreage. 19 years had passed since Mercy's death, since the night the main house burned and the Harroway family was buried alive in their own orchard. The oak tree shrine had become a landmark, marked on maps used by the Underground Railroad, visited by thousands who needed to remember that resistance was possible. But something new was happening at Harroway. The soil, which had refused to grow anything for nearly 2 decades, suddenly began to stir with life. First, it was just weeds, resilient plants that could grow anywhere. Then wildflowers, splashes of color against the dead earth. By spring, saplings had taken root in the foundation of the burned house, their roots breaking through the charred bricks, their branches reaching toward a sky that had witnessed so much suffering. The transformation puzzled botanists who heard about it. The soil should have been exhausted, depleted by decades of intensive agriculture, and then poisoned by tragedy. Yet something was feeding these plants, giving them strength and vitality that defied scientific explanation. The slaves and freedmen who visited the shrine understood what the scientists could not. The land was healing itself, purging the blood and pain that had soaked into it over generations. Mercy's vengeance had broken the cycle, allowing the earth to finally cleanse itself of accumulated suffering. In nearby Milledgeville, now the capital of Georgia, politicians debated secession with increasing urgency. The Confederacy was forming, and Georgia would soon join it. Young men drilled in town squares, preparing for a war they were certain would be quick and glorious. Old men who remembered previous wars knew better, but said little, their warnings dismissed by those too young to have learned wisdom through loss. Among these old men was James Harroway, Jonathan's younger brother, who had inherited what remained of the family name, if not its former prosperity. He was 63 now, his hair white, his hands trembling with palsy. He had not set foot on the ruins of his brother's plantation in 19 years, had tried to forget what had happened there, had convinced himself it was just a tragic accident compounded by rebellious slaves. But the approaching war and his own advancing mortality had brought him face to face with questions he had spent 2 decades avoiding. On a cold January morning, he rode alone to the ruins, needing to see for himself what had become of the place where his family had died, where a girl's suffering had transformed into something that still haunted George's collective consciousness. He tied his horse at the tree line and walked slowly through the overgrown property. Where cotton fields had once stretched to the horizon, now wild growth reclaimed the land, blackberry brambles, pine saplings, kudzu beginning its inexorable conquest. The slave quarters still stood, weathered but intact, used occasionally by travelers needing shelter. The barn had collapsed under its own weight sometime in the past decade, but the main house... James stopped when he reached the foundation. What had been a burned ruin was now something else, a garden, wild and chaotic, but undeniably alive. The saplings he had heard about had grown into young trees, their roots cracking the brick foundation, pulling it back into the earth, piece by piece. Vines covered what remained of the walls. Flowers bloomed in January, which should have been impossible. And in the center of it all, where the parlor had once been, where Eleanor had served tea and maintained the fiction of civilization built on brutality, a single rosebush grew. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in blooms despite the winter cold. The roses were white, pure and clean, and their scent was overwhelming, not the cloying sweetness of typical roses, but something sharper, more honest, carrying hints of earth and rain and growing things. James approached the bush slowly, drawn by something he couldn't name. As he got closer, he saw that carved into the brick at its base, barely visible beneath the vines, was a name: Mercy. He fell to his knees, the pretense he had maintained for 19 years finally crumbling. "God forgive us," he whispered. "God forgive us all for what we did." "God might," a voice said behind him, and James spun around to find himself facing a young woman. She wore a simple dress, her feet were bare, and on her shoulder he could see the faint mark of an old brand. His heart hammered in his chest because he recognized her from descriptions he had heard, from nightmares he had suffered, from the guilt he had carried for 19 years. "You're not real," he said, his voice shaking. "You're dead. You've been dead for 19 years. "Yes," Mercy agreed, tilting her head in that unsettling way she had. "Dead, but not gone. Buried, but not forgotten. Avenged, but not satisfied." "What do you want from me?" James asked desperately. "I wasn't here. I didn't own slaves. I spoke against my brother's cruelty when I dared. I'm not responsible for what happened to you." Mercy walked closer, her footsteps making no sound on the broken bricks. "You weren't here," she agreed, "but you benefited. Your wife wore dresses sewn by hands that bled in your brother's fields. Your children ate food grown by people who were starving. Your wealth, your comfort, your entire way of life was built on a foundation of suffering, and you knew it. You always knew it." "I didn't know how to stop it," James protested. "The system was too big, too entrenched. What could one man do?" "One man?" Mercy's expression was almost sad. "One man could have freed his own slaves, could have used his voice, his platform, his privilege to advocate for change, could have refused to be complicit even if he couldn't single-handedly end the institution." She paused. "But instead, you remained silent, convinced yourself that silence was neutrality, that not actively participating in cruelty absolved you of responsibility for allowing it to continue." James had no response. He knelt in the ruins of his brother's house, surrounded by new life growing from old death, and faced truths he had spent his entire life avoiding. "The war that's coming," Mercy said quietly, "it's going to cost this region everything. Hundreds of thousands will die. Cities will burn. The South will be destroyed and remade. And when it's over, people like you will have to decide whether you learned anything from the suffering, whether you understand now that human beings cannot be property, that convenience doesn't justify cruelty, that silence in the face of evil is its own form of evil. "Are you going to kill me?" James asked, his voice barely audible. Mercy shook her head. "No, you're going to live. You're going to watch everything you knew destroyed. You're going to see the system you were too weak to oppose collapse in blood and fire. And you're going to have to live with the knowledge that it could have been different, that if people like you had found courage instead of making excuses, maybe none of this would have been necessary." She turned to leave, then paused. "Take care of this place," she said, gesturing to the wild garden growing in the ruins. "Let it grow. Let life return to soil that drank too much death. It won't bring back anyone who died here, won't undo the suffering, but it's something, a small payment on a debt that can never be fully repaid." James nodded, unable to speak through his tears. When he looked up again, Mercy was gone, vanished like morning mist under sun. He didn't know if she had been real or a hallucination brought on by guilt and age. It didn't matter. The message was the same either way. He returned to Milledgeville and began quietly using what remained of his fortune to help slaves escape north. It was dangerous, potentially fatal if discovered, but he did it anyway. It wasn't enough to balance the scales. Nothing could be, but it was what he could do, and doing something was better than the silence he had maintained for 63 years. The Civil War began in April 1861. By the time it ended in 1865, more than 600,000 Americans were dead. The South was in ruins, and slavery was finally legally abolished. But the war that should have settled the question of human equality only began it. Reconstruction brought new challenges, new forms of oppression dressed in different clothes. The fight that Mercy had represented was far from over. But at Harroway, the land continued to heal. The wild garden became a forest. The foundation was completely consumed by growth, returned to the earth that had birthed it. The lightning-struck oak remained, its hollow serving as a shrine where people still left offerings, still whispered prayers, still asked for strength or justice, or simply acknowledgement that their suffering was real. The figurine Sarah had left, the carved wooden goddess with chains on her ankles and fire in her eyes, still glowed at night, its light visible for miles. During the war, both Union and Confederate soldiers reported seeing it, and both sides gave the ruins a wide berth, as if some instinct warned them that this was sacred ground, or cursed ground, or perhaps both. After the war, during Reconstruction, freed slaves began returning to the areas where they had been held in bondage. Some wanted to reclaim land that had been worked by their families for generations. Others simply wanted to witness the end of an era, to see with their own eyes that the plantations that had seemed eternal were just temporary structures after all, built on sand rather than stone. Many of these freedmen visited Harroway. They came to pay respects, to leave offerings, to tell their children and grandchildren about what had happened there. The story of Mercy became part of the oral tradition, passed down through generations, evolving but never losing its essential truth, that there are limits to what humans can endure, and that those who ignore those limits do so at their peril. In 1870, a group of freedmen purchased the Harroway land at auction. They had pooled their resources, their life savings, to buy the place where many of them had been enslaved, where their families had suffered, where Mercy had made her stand. They did not want to farm it. The land was too haunted, too heavy with history. Instead, they declared it a memorial site, a place of remembrance. They cleared paths through the forest, but left the wild growth largely untouched. They repaired the slave quarters and turned them into a small museum documenting the history of slavery in Georgia. They built a proper marker at the base of the lightning-struck oak, bronze letters spelling out not just Mercy's story, but the names of everyone who had died on Harroway plantation over its 50-year operation. Names recovered from old records, from memories, from the collective knowledge of the freed community. 143 names were recorded on that memorial, though everyone knew there were more, people who had died without being counted, without being recorded, without leaving any trace except the labor they had provided and the suffering they had endured. The dedication ceremony was held on July 4, 1871, Independence Day, though the irony of celebrating freedom on land that had been built on bondage was not lost on anyone present. Former slaves, Union veterans, and a handful of white allies gathered around the new memorial as a local preacher offered words of remembrance and hope. "We stand on blood-soaked ground," Reverend Samuel Cross said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Ground that has witnessed unspeakable suffering, that has absorbed tears and blood and the cries of those who died without justice. But look around you. Look at what's growing here now. Life returns even to places of death. Beauty emerges even from tragedy. This is the lesson of Harroway, that nothing, no matter how evil, no matter how entrenched, is permanent. Everything changes. Everything can be transformed." He paused, placing his hand on the memorial stone. "We remember Mercy, not just for what she did, but for what she represents. She was every slave who wanted to fight back but couldn't, every mother who watched her children sold away, every father who died in the fields, every person who suffered in silence because speaking meant death. She was all of us, all our rage and pain and desperate need for justice. And when she finally acted, when she refused to accept her fate, she showed the world that we are human, fully, completely, undeniably human, and humans have limits, have rights, have dignity that cannot be permanently destroyed no matter how hard you try." The crowd sang spirituals, the same songs that had provided comfort and coded communication during slavery. But now they sang them freely, openly, without fear of punishment. The lyrics were the same, but their meaning had changed. What had been songs of endurance were now songs of triumph, of survival, of memory. As the sun set on that July evening, the light in Sarah's wooden figurine began to glow, as it did every night. But this time, something different happened. People reported that the light expanded, grew brighter, seemed to fill the entire clearing with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. And in that light, they swore they saw figures, shadows that might have been memories, might have been spirits, might have been nothing more than hope and grief made briefly visible. They saw a woman being whipped, her back crisscrossed with scars. They saw a man standing on an auction block, being examined like livestock. They saw children being torn from their mother's arms. They saw decades of suffering compressed into moments, all of it witnessed, all of it remembered, none of it forgotten or forgiven. And at the center of it all, they saw Mercy, not as she had been at the end, broken, dying, consumed by vengeance, but as she might have been if the world had been different. Young, whole, smiling, free. She stood in the light and looked out at the gathered crowd, her eyes reflecting something that might have been peace or might have been promise, and she raised one hand in what could have been blessing or acknowledgement or simply goodbye. Then the light faded back to its normal, gentle glow, and the visions disappeared like morning dreams, leaving only the certainty that something profound had occurred. Some barrier between past and present had grown momentarily thin, allowing the dead to witness that they were remembered, that their suffering had not been meaningless, that the story continued even after they were gone. An elderly woman in the crowd began to weep. Her name was Rebecca, and she had been 12 years old when Mercy died, had witnessed the punishment that preceded her disappearance, had been among those who filled the graves in the orchard. She was 70 now, her hair white, her body bent with age and hard labor. "She's at peace now," Rebecca said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the evening breeze. All these years I wondered if she ever found rest, or if she was trapped here by what happened, by what she'd done. But I felt it just now. She's free, finally, truly free. Reverend Cross placed his hand gently on Rebecca's shoulder. Are you certain? Rebecca nodded, wiping tears from her weathered cheeks. I'm certain. The anger's gone. The need for vengeance is satisfied. What walks here now ain't Mercy's rage anymore. It's just her memory, her story, and that's enough. That's what she wanted all along, I think. Not revenge, really, but to be remembered, to have her suffering acknowledged, to know that she mattered. As darkness settled completely over Harroway, the crowd dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave, but knowing they had witnessed something that marked an ending as much as a beginning. They would return to their homes, their new lives as freed people, still navigating a world that had not fully accepted their humanity despite the war's outcome. But they carried with them the knowledge that they came from survivors, from people who had endured the unendurable and still found ways to resist, to maintain dignity, to refuse complete destruction. Over the following decades, Harroway Memorial became a pilgrimage site, not just for former slaves and their descendants, but for anyone who needed to understand the full weight of America's original sin. Historians came to study the documented history. Artists came to capture the haunting beauty of the wild forest growing from ruins. Teachers brought students to ensure that the comfortable fictions about the Old South were confronted with uncomfortable truths. The stories about Mercy herself evolved over time. Some remembered her as a vengeful ghost, a cautionary tale about the consequences of cruelty. Others saw her as a martyr, a saint who had sacrificed herself to wake people from their moral complacency. Still others understood her as simply human, a girl who had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits and responded with the only tools left available to her. All of these interpretations were true in their way. Mercy contained multitudes, meant different things to different people, served different purposes in different contexts. That was perhaps her final gift. She could not be reduced to a simple narrative, could not be made comfortable or easy to digest. She remained complex, troubling, challenging anyone who encountered her story to examine their own relationship to justice, power, and the limits of endurance. By the turn of the 20th century, as America entered a new era of industrial growth and imperial ambition, the Harroway Memorial faced new challenges. Developers wanted the land for commercial purposes. Local authorities argued that dwelling on the past prevented progress. There were attempts to minimize the story, to reframe it as an unfortunate incident rather than a symptom of systemic evil. But the descendants of those who had been enslaved at Harroway fought to preserve the site. They formed committees, raised funds, petitioned state and federal governments. The memorial became a test case for whether America was willing to preserve evidence of its own worst impulses, or whether it would prefer to bury uncomfortable history along with the bodies it had created. The preservationists won, though narrowly. Harroway Memorial was designated a protected historical site in 1903, ensuring that it would remain intact for future generations. The victory was significant not just for the specific site, but for what it represented, an acknowledgement, however grudging, that the nation's history of slavery could not be forgotten or erased, that the suffering of millions of people deserved recognition and remembrance. In 1925, on the 84th anniversary of Mercy's death, a national gathering was held at Harroway. Thousands attended. Descendants of slaves from across the South, civil rights activists, historians, and a small but growing number of white Americans who understood that confronting this history was essential to building a better future. Among the attendees was an elderly man named Isaiah Brown, great-grandson of old Isaiah who had witnessed the events of 1841. Young Isaiah, as he was still called despite being 73, had spent his life documenting the stories of former slaves, collecting oral histories before they were lost forever. He stood before the memorial stone and read from notes his great-grandfather had left, accounts of life on Harroway plantation, descriptions of the people who had lived and died there, and finally the story of Mercy's last days and the vengeance that followed. "My great-grandfather wrote this when he was 85 years old," Isaiah said, his voice strong despite his age. He wanted future generations to know what happened here, to understand that the people who were enslaved were not abstractions or statistics, but humans with names and dreams and dignity that could be violated but never completely destroyed. He held up a yellowed piece of paper, carefully preserved for decades. He wrote, "Tell them that Mercy was kind before she was cruel, that she was broken before she was avenged, that she tried every peaceful means before resorting to violence. Tell them that what she did was not right, but it was human, and that humanity is what they tried to take from all of us. Tell them that we survived, that we remembered, that we kept faith even when faith seemed foolish. And tell them that the fight continues, that freedom on paper means nothing without justice in practice, that the work of making America live up to its promises has barely begun." The crowd was silent, absorbing these words from across the decades, words that felt as relevant in 1925 as they had been in 1851. The lynchings were still happening. Jim Crow laws were still enforced. The promise of Reconstruction had been betrayed. The fight that Mercy had represented was far from finished. But something was building. The Great Migration was underway, millions of Black Americans leaving the South for opportunities in northern cities. The Harlem Renaissance was flowering, producing art and literature that demanded recognition of Black humanity and achievement. Organizations like the NAACP were fighting systematic discrimination in courts and legislatures. The seeds of what would become the civil rights movement were being planted, watered by the blood and sacrifice of generations. Mercy's story became part of this larger narrative of resistance and resilience. She was invoked in speeches, referenced in literature, painted on murals in Black communities across the nation. She became a symbol that transcended the specifics of her life and death, representing the moment when oppression exceeded endurance, when the oppressed struck back, when consequence finally caught up with cruelty. Not everyone was comfortable with this symbolism. Critics argued that celebrating Mercy's violence, even contextually, sent the wrong message, encouraged the wrong tactics. These debates were fierce and genuine, reflecting deeper questions about the role of violence in social change, about when, if ever, retributive justice was justified. But those who had lived closest to the experience of oppression generally understood something that comfortable critics did not: that judging Mercy required first acknowledging the system that created her, that condemning her violence while ignoring the violence inflicted upon her was itself a form of moral blindness. The years passed, the Depression came and went, World War II was fought and won. The civil rights movement finally erupted into national consciousness in the 1950s and 60s, bringing with it new heroes, new martyrs, new stories of resistance and sacrifice. But Harroway Memorial remained, a constant reminder of where the struggle had come from, of the deep roots that fed the movement for equality and justice. Civil rights workers visited the site for inspiration. Student activists came to connect their own struggles to longer histories of resistance. Even white allies made pilgrimages, seeking to understand the depth of the wrong that needed to be righted. In 1968, in the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, a spontaneous gathering formed at Harroway. Thousands arrived without any formal organization, simply needing to be somewhere that honored the long struggle, somewhere that acknowledged both the suffering and the resistance that suffering had produced. They stood in silence around the memorial stone, around the lightning-struck oak that still stood after 127 years, around the wild forest that had reclaimed the ruins. And as night fell, the light in Sarah's wooden figurine burned brighter than anyone had seen it in decades, as if responding to the collective grief and determination of those who had gathered. An old woman stepped forward from the crowd. Her name was Mary, and she had been born in 1880, had lived through the end of Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through 2 world wars, through the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. She had marched with King, had been arrested for sitting at a whites-only lunch counter, had registered black voters in Mississippi despite death threats. She had given her life to the movement, and now, at 88 years old, she stood before Mercy's memorial with tears streaming down her face. "We're still fighting," she said, her voice cracking. "Dr. King is dead, Malcolm is dead, Medgar is dead. So many are dead, and sometimes it feels like nothing changes, like we're just repeating the same struggle over and over." She placed her weathered hand on the memorial stone. "But then I come here and I remember that we've survived worse, that our ancestors endured things I can't even imagine, and they survived. They fought, they resisted. They preserved their humanity even when the entire world was trying to strip it away." She looked up at the crowd. Mercy fought, and she lost in some ways, lost her life, lost her innocence, lost everything they could take from her. But she won in other ways. She made them see us as human. She made them afraid. She reminded them that there are limits, that consequence exists, that you can't build heaven on someone else's hell without eventually paying the price. Mary's words resonated through the crowd, and slowly people began to sing, not the old spirituals this time, but a newer song. "We shall overcome." The voices rose into the Georgia night, carrying with them grief and hope and determination, the same mixture of emotions that had sustained resistance for generations. And in that moment, as hundreds of voices joined together in song, the boundary between past and present seemed to dissolve. The people who had died fighting for freedom felt present somehow, their spirits standing alongside those who continued the struggle. Mercy was there, and old Isaiah, and Sarah Blackwood, and all the unnamed thousands who had been buried in unmarked graves, whose stories had been lost, but whose suffering had not been meaningless. The fight continued. Through the 1970s and 80s, through backlash and progress and setbacks and victories, the work of creating actual equality persisted. Harroway Memorial remained a touchstone, a place to return to when the struggle felt overwhelming, when progress seemed impossible, when the temptation to give up was strong. By the late 20th century, as the nation approached the new millennium, attitudes toward places like Harroway had begun to shift. There was growing recognition that confronting difficult history was essential, that pretending the past hadn't happened only ensured that its poison would continue to infect the present. The memorial was expanded. New exhibits were added documenting not just slavery, but its aftermath, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, the ongoing struggle for racial justice. Educational programs were established. School groups began visiting regularly, ensuring that new generations understood where they came from and what had been sacrificed to bring them to this moment. The lightning-struck oak, now more than 150 years old, had become gnarled and ancient, its hollow deeper, its branches spreading like arms, trying to embrace the entire clearing. Botanists marveled that it still lived, that something so damaged could persist for so long. But those who understood the deeper significance knew that its survival was not botanical, but symbolic. As long as the oak stood, the memory of what happened here would endure. In 2001, on the 160th anniversary of Mercy's death, a new generation gathered at Harroway. They were descendants of slaves and descendants of slaveholders, activists and scholars, young people who had grown up hearing the stories and old people who carried living memory of the civil rights era. The keynote speaker was Dr. Angela Hayes, a historian who had spent 20 years researching slavery in Georgia. She stood before the crowd, looking out at faces of every age and color, and spoke about the meaning of Mercy's story for contemporary America. "We like to think of history as past," she said, "something that happened to other people in other times, something we've moved beyond. But the truth is that history is present. It lives in our institutions, our wealth disparities, our incarceration rates, our education systems. The plantation economy may be gone, but its legacy persists in every metric of inequality we measure." She gestured to the memorial stone behind her. Mercy's story disturbs us because it refuses to let us be comfortable. It reminds us that suffering has consequences, that injustice creates pressure that must be released somehow, that peace without justice is just delayed violence. We want simple stories about heroes and villains, about clear right and wrong. But Mercy gives us complexity. She was victim and avenger, martyr and murderer, human pushed beyond the limits of what humans should be asked to endure. Dr. Hayes paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. The question Mercy asks us is not, was she justified? The question is, what are we doing to ensure that no one else ever faces the choices she faced? What are we building so that future generations don't have to choose between silent suffering and violent resistance? How are we creating a world where justice is accessible through peaceful means, where human dignity is protected by law and custom, where no one has to call on darkness for help because the light has failed them? The crowd was silent, contemplating these questions that had no easy answers, that required ongoing commitment and sacrifice and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. As the sun set on that July evening in 2001, as the light in Sarah's figurine began its nightly glow, something remarkable happened. All around the memorial, fireflies emerged, thousands of them, far more than should have been present, creating a living constellation that filled the clearing with light. They danced through the air, their bioluminescence pulsing in patterns that almost seemed intentional, almost looked like the shapes of people, the forms of bodies moving in celebration or remembrance, or simply being. Children in the crowd laughed with delight, chasing the fireflies. Adults watched in wonder, some pulling out phones to capture the moment, others simply experiencing it, knowing that some things were meant to be witnessed rather than recorded. An old man at the edge of the crowd smiled, tears running down his face. His name was Thomas, and he was 93 years old, great-great-grandson of Thomas Harroway, who had died buried alive in the orchard. He had spent his life trying to atone for his ancestors' sins, working for racial justice, donating to civil rights organizations, showing up for the hard work of reconciliation. "Forgiveness," he whispered to himself, though he wasn't sure if he was asking for it or witnessing it. He had never been certain whether seeking forgiveness for ancestral wrongs made sense, whether guilt could be inherited, whether redemption was possible for historical crimes. But he had tried anyway, because doing nothing felt like continuing the crime, and he had needed to do something. As the fireflies continued their dance, as night settled fully over Harroway, the crowd slowly dispersed, carrying with them the experience of the evening. The reminder that history was not dead but living, that the past shaped the present in countless visible and invisible ways, that the work of justice was never finished but required constant renewal and recommitment. The memorial remained as it had for 130 years, as it would for decades and centuries to come. The oak stood, the light glowed, the forest grew, and Mercy's story persisted, passed down through generations, evolving but never losing its essential truth. That human beings have limits to what they can endure, that suffering creates debt that must eventually be paid, and that those who inflict cruelty must face consequence, whether in life or in memory, whether from human law or from forces that transcend law entirely.